1. The Awakening in a Foreign Past. April 1934, Verdun, France. The first thing he felt was pain. A dull, insistent pressure in his skull, as if a vice were squeezing his head. His body ached like he had been thrown into a trench and left for dead. His breath came slow and ragged, his mind groggy and disoriented. Then came the smell, a strange mix of cigarette smoke, damp wool, gun oil, and leather. Where the hell am I? His eyes fluttered open. This was not his apartment, not his bed. The ceiling was old and wooden, the walls made of rough stone. The window on the far side of the room had iron bars over it. A military-style cot creaked as he tried to move. A bolt of panic shot through his chest. This wasn't normal. He forced himself up, ignoring the nausea rolling through him. The room was small, Spartan, and utilitarian. A wooden chair, a metal helmet resting on a desk cluttered with maps and documents, and a long rifle propped against the wall. His eyes locked onto a uniform draped over the back of the chair. Dark blue wool, gold epaulets, military insignia. His hands trembled as he reached for the papers stacked neatly on the desk. His vision swam for a moment, then focused. A military identification card. His fingers tightened around the thick paper, his heart pounding. The name at the top made his breath hitch. Captain Étienne Moreau, 2e Division Blindée, Armée Française. His own name. His own handwriting on the documents. But the date. Avril 1934. His fingers went cold. April 1934. That wasn't possible. He had gone to sleep in 2025. His last memory was what? He tried to recall the details. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He had been a military historian, a professor at the École Militaire, a researcher specializing in World War II strategy. He had spent his life studying wars, dissecting battle plans, writing books on the failures of the French High Command in 1940. He remembered debating colleagues about how France could have prevented its collapse, about how its military doctrine was outdated, about how its leadership was blind to modern warfare. Then he remembered the accident. A dark street, rain-slick asphalt, the sudden flash of headlights, the force of impact, and then this. His breath hitched. He wasn't in a dream. He wasn't hallucinating. Somehow, someway he had woken up in 1934. His reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the desk made his blood run cold. The face staring back at him was his, but not quite. Younger, less worn. No lines of age, no graying hair. He reached up and ran a hand over his jaw clean-shaven. His fingers brushed against the smooth fabric of a French officer's uniform. This is real. The room suddenly shook with the slam of a door. Moreau, Putain, are you still asleep? A rough voice, thick with a Parisian accent, snapped him from his daze. He turned sharply, his instincts kicking in, his body moving before his mind could process it. A man stepped into the room, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, his uniform slightly disheveled. A cigarette dangled from his lips, and he was holding a folder under one arm. The sight of him triggered a memory that wasn't his own. Pierre Renaud. Lieutenant Pierre Renaud, his second in command. His mind started working. Memories that weren't his own flooded his brain, drinking together, arguing about tactics, enduring brutal winter exercises. Renaud frowned. You look like shit, he muttered, stepping inside. Late night at the officers' mess? Or are you finally realizing you shouldn't have joined the cavalry, mon ami? He forced himself to stay calm. Just a headache, he said, keeping his voice steady. Renaud snorted, tossing the folder onto the desk. Murd, you're getting old. He let out a slow breath, fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. He needed to think, needed to understand his situation before he made a mistake. Where are we stationed right now? He asked carefully. Renaud raised an eyebrow. Verdun, he said. Unless you've been transferred to Paris overnight and forgot to tell me. Verdun, the site of one of the deadliest battles of World War I, a symbol of French resilience. And in 1934, a strategic outpost near the Maginot Line. His mind raced. In 6 years, the German army would bypass Verdun entirely, smashing through the Ardennes and cutting through France's defenses like a knife through butter. What's the briefing about? He asked, flipping open the folder. Renaud exhaled smoke, leaning against the doorframe. Routine drill reports. Colonel Perrin wants an update on our tank exercises. His pulse quickened. Tank exercises. In 1934, France had tanks, but they didn't know how to use them properly. The 2nd Armored Division was one of the few experimenting with mechanized warfare, but the High Command still viewed tanks as infantry support weapons, not independent strike forces. This was his chance. You seem interested all of a sudden, Renaud observed, crossing his arms. He tapped a finger against the desk. I've been thinking, he said slowly, testing the waters. We should start training our crews differently. Less like artillery units, more like maneuverable strike forces. Renaud gave him a strange look. Murd, you sound like de Gaulle. His breath caught. De Gaulle. In 1934, Charles de Gaulle was a relatively unknown officer, but he was already advocating for modern armored warfare. The French High Command ignored him. If he could get people to listen earlier, maybe just maybe he could change things. Renaud sighed. Look, you know how Perrin is. He'll have our heads if we try to shake things up too much. He met Renaud's gaze. And what if Perrin's wrong? Renaud blinked. What? He straightened his uniform, ignoring the pounding in his skull. What if everything we know about modern warfare is wrong? Renaud stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head with a chuckle. Murd, maybe that headache knocked something loose in your brain. He glanced at his watch. Come on, Capitaine. If we're late, Perrin will make us clean the tank garages for a week. He nodded and followed him out into the crisp morning air. One step at a time. One battle at a time. If he played this right, maybe France wouldn't have to fall in 1940. Maybe he could rewrite history. 2. Orders and realizations. The camp was already alive with activity. Soldiers in blue-gray uniforms moved between trucks, mechanics worked on tanks, and junior officers barked orders. 1934, Verdun, France. It still didn't feel real. He forced himself to walk with confidence, matching Lieutenant Pierre Renaud's pace. His body responded like it had done this 1,000 times before because it had. Somehow, this body retained muscle memory, habits, and instinct. He wasn't stumbling around like a lost man. He was a French army captain, and everyone around him treated him as such. But his mind, his soul was something else entirely. Renaud pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it with a casual flick. You're acting strange, Moreau, he muttered, exhaling smoke. How so? He asked, keeping his voice even. You're too quiet. Usually, you'd be complaining about the lack of decent coffee by now. He smirked slightly. Maybe I finally got used to military life. Renaud gave him a sidelong glance, skeptical but unconcerned. If that were true, we'd have to check if someone replaced you with a German spy. That comment hit too close to home. He was, in a way, a foreigner in this time period. But he forced out a chuckle and kept walking. Ahead of them, a row of Renault FT tanks, small, archaic by modern standards, stood parked near a maintenance station. Oil stains and the scent of burning fuel filled the air. Mechanics in overalls worked on the engines, wiping grime off their hands. This was the heart of the 2nd Armored Division, one of France's earliest attempts at modernizing its military. And it was painfully outdated. France had the numbers, the resources, the industry, but it had no vision. He clenched his fists. In 6 years, his army would crumble in weeks. Not because they lacked soldiers or weapons, but because of bad strategy, arrogance, and outdated doctrine. He knew what was coming, and no one else did. Not yet. The command building was a stone structure, repurposed from an old World War I fort. A red and blue French flag hung outside, fluttering in the breeze. They entered, walking past a few junior officers who saluted quickly before returning to their reports. The hallway smelled of ink, paper, and faint traces of old gunpowder. They stopped in front of an office door. Colonel Jean Perrin was painted in bold letters on the plaque. Renaud knocked once before pushing it open. Captain Moreau and Lieutenant Renaud, reporting as ordered, Renaud said crisply. The man behind the desk barely looked up. Colonel Jean Perrin was an aging officer with thinning gray hair, a sharp mustache, and cold blue eyes. His uniform was immaculate, his medals carefully polished. A man who had survived the trenches of 1914 to 1918 and never let anyone forget it. You're late, Perrin said, voice gruff. Renaud kept a straight face. Apologies, sir. Perrin gestured at the 2 wooden chairs in front of his desk. Sit. They obeyed. The colonel didn't speak for a moment, flipping through a folder. Étienne caught a glimpse of the paper's training reports, personnel files, and logistics updates. Finally, Perrin looked up. His sharp gaze landed on Étienne. I understand you've been advocating some changes, the colonel said. Étienne kept his face neutral. So soon? Had someone already reported his comments? Sir, your enthusiasm for armored warfare, Perrin said, tapping a pen against his desk. Your suggestions about using tanks independently rather than as infantry support. Lieutenant Renaud tells me you've been talking about it since yesterday. Étienne's mind raced. He had only been in this world for a few hours. How much had the old him already discussed? He glanced at Renaud, who looked as puzzled as he was. Renaud hadn't reported anything, so someone else had been listening. Étienne met Perrin's gaze. Yes, sir. I believe our current doctrine is outdated. Perrin leaned back in his chair. Outdated. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of challenge. Étienne chose his words carefully. Sir, times are changing. Tanks are no longer just battlefield accessories. In the next war, they will be decisive weapons, not just support for infantry charges. Perrin snorted. The next war? Moreau, do you know something I don't? More than you can imagine. He kept his expression impassive. Germany is rearming, sir. Hitler is pushing the boundaries of the Versailles Treaty. The British and Americans might not act, but we should be preparing for any possibility. Perrin narrowed his eyes. And you believe tanks are the answer? Yes, sir. If we invest in mobility, speed, and coordinated attacks, we can avoid the kind of stalemates that defined the last war. A well-trained armored division could outmaneuver an entire infantry corps. Perrin stared at him for a long moment, then scoffed. You sound like de Gaulle. That was twice today someone had compared him to Charles de Gaulle. Étienne kept his face blank. Is that a bad thing, sir? Perrin exhaled slowly. De Gaulle is a stubborn dreamer. He talks of maneuver warfare, of fast-moving mechanized units, but this army is built on solid, disciplined formations. Trench warfare won us the last war. It also cost us millions of lives, sir, Étienne said before he could stop himself. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Perrin's blue eyes locked onto him, sharp as a dagger. Renaud shifted uncomfortably beside him. Careful, Capitaine, Perrin said, voice quiet but dangerous. We do not disrespect the dead in this office. Étienne took a breath. He had to tread carefully. I would never disrespect the dead, sir, he said firmly. I am saying that we must honor them by ensuring that we never fight another war the same way. Perrin studied him. Finally, the colonel sighed and tapped a stack of papers. The Minister de la Guerre has already ordered new tanks. Somua S-35S, Hotchkiss H-35S. They will arrive in the coming months, but they will still be assigned to infantry divisions. That is a mistake, sir, Étienne said before he could stop himself. Perrin's eyebrow twitched. Étienne exhaled. Slow down. Be smart. Don't push too hard. Respectfully, sir, I would like to propose an experimental exercise, he said. A simple drill where we test fast-moving armor units independent of infantry command. Perrin drummed his fingers on the desk. A long pause. Then, to Étienne's surprise, the colonel gave a small nod. You get 2 Renault FTs and 1 Somua, he said. Nothing more. And I want a full report on my desk in 3 days. Étienne fought to keep his expression neutral. A test. A small one but a chance. Yes, sir, he said. Dismissed, Perrin said, already turning back to his paperwork. Étienne and Renaud stood, saluted, and left the office. Renaud let out a long breath as soon as they were outside. What the hell was that, Moreau? Étienne shrugged. A discussion. Renaud looked at him like he'd grown a second head. You don't just argue with Perrin about tactics. Do you have a death wish? No, Étienne said. But I do have a plan. 3. First moves in a stagnant army. The corridor outside Colonel Perrin's office was quieter than before. The scent of old paper and ink still lingered in the air, but Étienne barely noticed it. His mind was already racing ahead. He had just secured his first step. 2 Renault FTs and 1 Somua S-35. It wasn't much. The Renaults were relics from the last war, small, slow, and lightly armed. The Somua S-35, on the other hand, was one of the best tanks France had, fast, well-armored, and deadly in the right hands. It wasn't enough to change the tide of history. Not yet, but it was a starting point. Are you actually serious about this? Renaud's voice broke through his thoughts. Étienne turned his head slightly. His lieutenant looked almost bewildered. You really think a bunch of tin cans are going to prove anything to Perrin? Renaud scoffed, lowering his voice as they stepped outside the stone building. Étienne inhaled deeply. I think, he said slowly, that if we can demonstrate even a fraction of what tanks are capable of, it will make people talk. Renaud snorted. Talk. Moreau, the entire army has been talking about tanks since 1918. And guess what? Nothing's changed. Do you really think a single exercise with 3 vehicles is going to change the minds of those old warhorses in Paris? Étienne stopped walking. Renaud took another drag from his cigarette, watching him with an amused yet skeptical gaze. Tell me something, Pierre. Étienne said, keeping his tone measured. When was the last time you saw an infantryman outrun a tank? Renault blinked. Well, he said after a moment, exhaling smoke. Never, obviously. And yet, Étienne continued, we still treat tanks like they belong behind the infantry instead of leading the charge. Renault narrowed his eyes, his amusement fading slightly. You're really serious about this, aren't you? Étienne met his gaze. I am. Renault let out a sigh. Murd. I was hoping this was just a passing phase. It isn't. Renault scratched the back of his neck, looking genuinely uncomfortable now. Look, Moreau. I like you. You're a good officer. But you're playing with fire. The high command doesn't like radical ideas. You start pushing too hard, and you'll end up transferred to some godforsaken garrison in North Africa. Étienne smirked. That wouldn't be the worst thing. At least he wouldn't be in a doomed army. But no, he had work to do here. Don't worry, he said. I'm not an idiot. We'll do the exercise quietly. We don't need to challenge Perrin, just give him results. Renault sighed again, rubbing his forehead. Fine. But if we get in trouble, I'm blaming you. Étienne chuckled. Noted. The motor pool was a large, open field near the barracks, where mechanics worked on half-tracks, trucks, and a handful of tanks. The scent of oil, fuel, and metal was stronger here, mixing with the occasional distant rumble of engines. Étienne and Renault approached a row of Renault FT light tanks, their dull green paint chipped and worn. One of the mechanics, a man with grease-streaked hands and a cigarette dangling from his lips, glanced up. Captain Moreau, the mechanic said, nodding. Étienne returned the nod. The old Moreau must have been known here. Where's the Saumua? Étienne asked. The mechanic smirked, wiping his hands on a rag. You mean the beauty? She's over there, sir. We keep her separate from these old clunkers. Étienne followed his gesture. There it was. The Saumua S-35. Sleek. Heavily armored. Faster than most French tanks. A machine built for modern warfare. It was the future, but in the hands of a military that didn't understand it. Étienne ran a hand along the cool metal. In another timeline, this machine would be wasted deployed piecemeal, scattered across defensive positions instead of concentrated into powerful armored divisions. Not this time. Not if he could help it. What's the status? He asked the mechanic. Tracks are good. Engine runs smooth. Had some trouble with the turret's traverse, but we fixed it, the mechanic said, patting the side of the tank like a proud father. She's ready for anything. Étienne nodded. Good. Renault leaned against the side of the Renault FT, arms crossed. All right, genius. What's the plan? Étienne looked at him. Speed, he said simply. I want to see just how fast we can maneuver these things. Renault gave him a dry look. You do realize the Renaults aren't exactly built for speed, right? Étienne smirked. That's why we have the Saumua. That evening, after the reports were filed and the base had settled into its usual late-night rhythm, Étienne sat at his desk, poring over maps. The dim light from his oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls. His mind was full of different thoughts. Everything he did had to be precise. Every move, every conversation, every drill had to be carefully calculated. One wrong step, and he could ruin everything. A knock at the door made him look up. Come in. The door creaked open, and Renault stepped inside, closing it behind him. Étienne raised an eyebrow. Did Perrin send you to keep an eye on me? Renault scoffed, pulling a chair over. No, but I figured I should at least try to understand what the hell you're doing. Étienne leaned back slightly. And? Renault sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, I'm not blind. I know we're lagging behind the Germans. I know our tactics are outdated. But you're talking about changing the entire army's way of thinking. That's not something one captain can do. Étienne nodded. I know. Renault frowned. Then what's your end goal, Moreau? Étienne studied him for a moment. How much could he say? How much should he say? He took a deep breath. My goal is to make sure that when war comes, and it will come, we're not caught standing still. Renault watched him carefully. And you really believe tanks are the answer? I don't just believe it, Étienne said. I know it. Renault exhaled, shaking his head. Murd. You really are serious about this. Étienne smirked. I told you. Renault sighed. Fine. I'll back you. But if this blows up in our faces, I'm transferring to the cavalry and pretending I never met you. Étienne chuckled. Deal. Renault stood, stretching. Get some sleep, Moreau. You look like you haven't had a decent night's rest in days. I haven't had a decent rest since I woke up in 1934. Yeah, Étienne muttered. I'll try. As Renault left, Étienne leaned forward, staring at the map again. His first test was set. 4. Machines of war. As he stepped into the motor pool, the sun was still creeping over the horizon, but the mechanics were already at work, the rhythmic clanking of wrenches and noise of engines filling the silence of dawn. Today was important. Today, he would see exactly what he had to work with. Standing near the parked tanks, Lieutenant Renault watched the mechanics with a cigarette dangling from his lips. His uniform jacket was unbuttoned, and his sleeves were rolled up, a sign that he had been here for a while already. "You're up early," Renault muttered without looking at him. "So are you," he replied, stepping closer. Renault exhaled a slow stream of smoke. "Figured I'd see what's got you so worked up." He gestured toward the tanks. "Your revolution in action?" His eyes flicked toward the row of Renault FT tanks parked in the yard. The Renault FT, the old veteran. The Renault FT was a small, boxy machine, its dull green paint chipped and worn with age. Two men could barely squeeze inside, the commander and the driver. The turret, though a revolutionary design in its time, looked almost comically small now. "Old, isn't it?" Renault said, nudging one with his boot. He nodded. "It's from the last war." And that was the problem. The Renault FT had been cutting edge in 1918, but by 1934, it was a relic. 7 millimeters of armor, barely enough to stop rifle rounds. A 37 millimeters SA-18 gun, short-barreled and weak, effective against trenches, but worthless against enemy armor. And the worst part? A top speed of 7 kilometers per hour. 7. It moved at the pace of a marching soldier. "You really think these things are going to prove anything?" Renault asked, lighting another cigarette. He didn't answer. He wasn't interested in the Renaults. His gaze drifted toward the one that actually mattered. The Somua S-35 sat slightly apart from the others, its angled armor catching the early morning light. It was larger, stronger, faster than the Renault FT. The turret was twice as big, the gun longer and more powerful. Unlike the boxy shape of the Renaults, the Somua had a sleek, sloped hull, built to deflect incoming shells. "Now this one's different," Renault muttered, following his gaze. He nodded. "It's the best tank we have." Renault scoffed. "If you can keep it running." He wasn't wrong. The mechanics hated the Somua. It was a pain to repair, the suspension was temperamental, and worst of all, the turret was a nightmare. One man had to command, aim, fire, and reload all at once. In the middle of battle, a commander should command, he muttered under his breath. Not do everything himself. "What was that?" Renault asked. He shook his head. "Nothing. Renault leaned against the Somua's hull, crossing his arms. "All right, Professor. Teach me something. What makes this thing so special?" He ran a hand along the armor. "The SA-35 47 millimeters gun. It can punch through most enemy armor at a kilometer away. The Renault's gun is useless past a few hundred meters." Renault raised an eyebrow. "That far?" He nodded. "And the armor 40 millimeters thick, well angled. It can survive hits that would tear a Renault apart. And the speed." He smiled. 40 kilometers per hour. Renault let out a low whistle. "So you're saying it can outrun everything else we have?" "Exactly." "All right," Renault said, exhaling smoke. "Then why aren't these things being used properly?" He took a breath. "Because the high command is stuck in the past." Renault frowned. "You're talking about Perrin?" He shook his head. "Not just him. All of them." He gestured toward the Renaults. "These were designed for trench warfare, for infantry support. And even now, they still think tanks should be nothing more than moving bunkers. And you don't." "No." He turned to face him. "I think tanks should be faster than infantry, not slower. They should be leading the charge, not waiting for orders." The mechanics finished their final checks, stepping back from the Somua. One of them, Durand, walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's ready, Captain," Durand said. "But try not to push her too hard." "Yeah?" He smiled. "No promises." A few minutes later, they were both climbing into the tank. The commander's seat was tight but familiar, and as soon as he settled in, something clicked in his mind. He knew this machine. Somewhere, deep in his memories, not of this life, but of the one before, had studied these controls. He had read the blueprints, the manuals, the battle reports. He knew how to drive this thing. Renault sat in the driver's seat, muttering curses under his breath. "I hate you," he smirked. "You'll love it once you get moving." Durand signaled from outside. "Everything's clear, Captain. Give her some room before you open the throttle." The engine roared to life, sending vibrations through the entire hull. The deep growl of the diesel engine was nothing like the weak sputtering of the Renaults. This was power. This was the future of warfare. Renault pushed forward on the controls, and the tank jerked into motion. The suspension was rough, the steering was heavy, but it moved. And it moved fast. Not just fast. Faster than anything else on this field. It bounced over the dirt, kicking up dust, roaring across the open terrain. He leaned forward, gripping the turret handles, watching the speedometer climb. If he could prove this machine's mobility and firepower, he could start convincing people. If he could show that speed and maneuverability won battles, then maybe, just maybe, he could change everything. The tank rumbled to a stop, the engine hissing as it cooled. Renault wiped sweat from his forehead. "All right," he admitted, breathing hard. "That was something." He smirked. "Told you." Renault looked back at the Renaults, still sitting motionless in the yard. "So what now?" he asked. "Now," he said, stepping out onto the sunlit ground. "We start training. We refine. We get better." He turned toward Renault. "And when the time comes, we prove it." 5. The first exercise. In the distance, rows of soldiers trained with rifles, their shouts blending with the sound of marching boots and distant hammering from the motor pool. But today, his attention was focused on something far more important: the first test of mechanized tactics. He approached a small clearing where the tanks had been prepared for the day's drill. 3 vehicles stood waiting. 2 Renault FT light tanks and 1 Somua S-35. Renault was already there, standing with his arms crossed, watching as mechanics finished their final checks. Moreau soon gathered the small team of tank commanders and drivers, spreading a rough map across the hood of a staff car. "All right, listen up," he said, pointing at the map. "This is how we're running today's exercise." The men leaned in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Most of them had never been part of an independent tank maneuver. They were used to working under direct infantry orders. "This is not a standard slow advance drill. We're not going to crawl forward, wait for artillery support, and move in rigid formations," he continued. "Instead, we'll use the Somua's speed and the Renault's maneuverability to execute a breakthrough." He pointed at the terrain. "We're simulating an enemy defensive line here." His finger traced the central area of the map. "The Renaults will push forward in a feint attack, drawing attention. Meanwhile, the Somua will flank at high speed, hit them from the side, and retreat before they can react." One of the tank commanders, Sergeant Marchand, frowned. "Sir, that's not how we've been trained. We're supposed to advance with infantry support, keep a slow and steady pace." He nodded. "I know, and that's exactly the problem." Marchand exchanged glances with another officer, Corporal Boucher, who hesitated before speaking. "Sir, if we do this without infantry, won't we be exposed?" "Not if we move fast enough," he replied. "The problem with our doctrine is that we treat tanks like mobile bunkers, not fast attack units. If we sit still, artillery and anti-tank guns will tear us apart. If we move fast and strike from unexpected angles, we'll control the battle." Marchand frowned. "But what about orders from command? If Colonel Perrin finds out?" He held up a hand. "This is an approved exercise. Perrin gave us permission to run drills with the vehicles. He didn't say how we had to run them." Renault snorted. "That's a dangerous way to play with words." He smirked. "It's also how we get results." The tank commanders still looked skeptical, but they weren't outright refusing. That was a start. "All right," he said, rolling up the map. "Let's mount up and begin." The first challenge was simply getting the tanks to coordinate. As the crews climbed into their vehicles, he slipped into the Somua's commander's seat, gripping the controls. The engine rumbled to life, its deep diesel growl filling the air. He adjusted the periscope, scanning the field. Ahead, the Renault FTs were already moving into position, their tiny turrets rotating clumsily. Their crews struggled to keep formation. They weren't used to moving without explicit infantry commands. "All right, Renaults, move forward at half speed," he ordered through the radio link. The old tanks groaned as they began creeping forward, their tracks kicking up dust. Then came the Somua's turn. He tapped his driver, Lefebvre, on the shoulder. "When I give the signal, I want full acceleration toward the right flank. We'll hold the flank for 5 seconds, then pull back before they can respond." Lefebvre glanced over his shoulder. "Sir, this thing's fast, but the turret's slow. If we go in too quick, we might not get a shot off before pulling back." He nodded. That was a problem. Unlike German panzer designs, the Somua's turret traverse was sluggish. If they moved too fast, it wouldn't be able to keep up with the target. "Then we'll pre-aim," he decided. Set the turret facing the impact zone before we start the charge. That way, we won't have to adjust on the move." Lefebvre grinned. "Smart thinking, sir." The Renaults reached the target zone, firing off blank rounds to simulate suppression fire. Their movements were slow, predictable, exactly what French doctrine expected. Then came the Sommua. "Go," he ordered. The engine roared, and the tank lurched forward, kicking up dirt as it shot across the open ground. 20 meters. Lefebvre called. The target zone loomed ahead. "Turret locked?" he asked the gunner. "Locked. Fire." The 47mm cannon thundered, the recoil shaking the hull as a direct hit slammed into the target post. "Pull back." Lefebvre threw the gears into reverse, and the Sommua darted back into cover, disappearing from the enemy's line of sight before they could react. A clean hit. A textbook breakthrough. But instead of cheers, what he heard was silence. Renault stepped up from behind the tanks, arms crossed. Marchand, Boucher, and the other commanders stood staring at the field, looking like they had just seen a ghost. Renault let out a low whistle. "Well, that was new." Marchand stepped forward, shaking his head. "Sir, I've never seen a tank move like that before." "Now you have," he said simply. Boucher blinked. "That was fast. Too fast for anyone to react." "That's the point," he said. "Speed wins battles." Marchand still looked unconvinced. "But in a real battle, wouldn't they have reinforcements? Artillery? More anti-tank guns?" "Of course," he agreed. "That's why we wouldn't do this alone. The key is not speed alone, it's coordination. We move fast, we work with other armored units, and we hit where the enemy isn't expecting." Marchand exchanged glances with Boucher. The skepticism was still there, but now there was something else too. Curiosity. Renault smirked. "You're actually getting through to them." He smiled slightly. That was the first step. But just as he was about to call for another drill, a harsh voice cut through the field. "Captain Moreau." He turned. Standing near the observation post was Major Clement, arms crossed, his expression like stone. Renault muttered a curse. "Looks like your approved training just got someone's attention." He exhaled slowly. This was expected. Change never came without resistance. He dusted off his uniform and straightened his cap. "Well," he muttered, "let's see how much trouble I'm in." 6. The resistance within. The moment he turned to face Major Louis Clement, he knew he was in trouble. The older officer stood tall, his uniform meticulously pressed, the buttons polished to a shine. His narrow, sharp eyes studied the training field with thinly veiled disdain, arms crossed over his chest. Everything about the man radiated authority, discipline, and rigid adherence to tradition. He was the kind of officer who had spent a career ensuring that nothing changed, that doctrine was followed to the letter, and that the past dictated the future. Behind him, a pair of adjutants stood at attention, their expressions unreadable. There was no mistaking the reason for Clement's presence. He had not come here by chance, he had come because of him. "Captain Moreau," Clement repeated, his voice clipped and cold. "Would you care to explain this?" Moreau remained calm, meeting the major's gaze without flinching. "A standard training exercise, sir. Approved by Colonel Perrin." His voice was measured, controlled. He already knew Clement wouldn't care about the approval. The real issue wasn't the paperwork, it was what the exercise represented. Clement's nostrils flared slightly. His gaze flickered toward the still smoking training targets, the dust cloud lingering from the Sommua's rapid maneuver. His expression hardened. "This is not how we conduct tank exercises," he said, his tone sharp with disapproval. There it was. The resistance. The old thinking. Moreau had read about men like Clement, had studied them in history books. Clement was not just an obstacle, he was the embodiment of everything wrong with the French army in 1934. A career officer, shaped by the horrors of World War I, he believed deeply in static defense, slow advances, and the primacy of infantry coordination. His entire philosophy was built on the lessons of the trenches, on the belief that caution and overwhelming firepower were the only ways to win a war. Men like Clement were not incompetent, they were trapped in the past. They had seen thousands of men die in futile charges across no man's land, had lived through Verdun and the Somme, had learned the hard way that offense without overwhelming artillery support was suicide. To them, the only safe way to fight was through careful, methodical advances, where every unit was tightly controlled from the top down. And now, he was staring at a young captain who had just thrown all of that out the window. "I read your report, Moreau," Clement said, tapping the folder he held under one arm. "It reads like a child's fantasy." Moreau didn't react. "Sir." Clement took a step forward, lowering his voice so only he, Lieutenant Renault, and the officers nearby could hear. This army is not some reckless band of cavalrymen, charging around like fools. We operate by discipline, by doctrine. We do not make up tactics on the spot. With respect, sir, Moreau replied carefully, we are not in 1918 anymore. If we fight the next war the same way we fought the last, we will lose. Clement's eyes flashed with irritation. And now you're a strategist, Moreau? A captain who suddenly believes he knows more than his superiors. Moreau held his ground. I believe that we must evolve, sir, or we will repeat the mistakes of the past. Clement exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Arrogance. You, and de Gaulle, think you can overturn a century of military wisdom overnight. So that was it. Clement despised de Gaulle. That explained a lot. Even now, Charles de Gaulle was already earning a reputation as an agitator, a man who challenged the army's deeply ingrained doctrines and pushed for independent armored divisions. His ideas were radical, and in the eyes of men like Clement, dangerous. Moreau had not even mentioned de Gaulle, yet his own advocacy for mechanized warfare was enough to brand him as part of the same problem. The real conflict here was bigger than Clement or even Perrin. It was about how the French army itself was structured. Command flowed strictly from the top down. Officers were expected to obey orders, not innovate. Tanks were considered support weapons, never meant to act independently. The Maginot Line and well-positioned artillery were seen as the ultimate solution to another German invasion, and any talk of maneuver warfare was dismissed as reckless and unnecessary. Many high-ranking officers were deeply conservative, seeing change as a threat to their authority. De Gaulle was one of the few voices advocating for mechanized warfare, and he was already facing resistance from the high command. Now, Clement saw Moreau as an extension of that ideology. Clement took another step closer, his voice dropping to a quiet but deadly tone. Listen to me, Moreau, he said, and listen well. This army does not belong to you. You are not a reformer, you are not a revolutionary, and you are certainly not a general. His tone hardened. You will follow the doctrine laid down by your superiors. You will cease this reckless obsession with tank warfare, and you will remember that you are a soldier, not a theorist. Silence hung between them. Renault shifted uneasily beside him. The other officers nearby were watching intently, waiting to see how Moreau would respond. Moreau kept his expression unreadable. He knew that one wrong word could give Clement exactly what he wanted: an excuse to have him reassigned, transferred, or worse. Of course, sir, he said finally, his voice calm. Clement studied him for a moment longer. Then, slowly, he straightened. Good. He turned to leave, but stopped just before stepping away. He glanced back over his shoulder. Oh, and Moreau. Moreau met his gaze. Yes, sir. Clement's expression remained neutral, but his voice was like ice. I will be watching you. With that, he strode away, his adjutants falling into step behind him. The moment Clement was out of earshot, Renault let out a long whistle. Well, he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. I'd say you made an enemy today. Moreau didn't reply immediately. He was still thinking, still processing the encounter. Clement had made his position clear: he would not tolerate deviation. But the major was not a fool. He would not act in anger. He would wait, observe, and then strike when Moreau was most vulnerable. Renault exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I don't know if you're brave or just insane. Probably both, Moreau said with a smirk, though there was little humor in it. Renault chuckled, but his tone turned serious again. Clement is dangerous. He's got pull in Paris. If he wants you gone, it won't take much. One bad report, one accusation of recklessness, and you'll be on the next transport to a dead-end post in Algeria. I know, Moreau admitted. They walked in silence for a moment before Renault sighed. Murd, I guess we just have to be smart about this, don't we? Moreau gave a small smile. That's the plan. Renault smirked. Then I'd better make sure you don't get yourself killed before you even get to the war. They both turned back toward the tanks, the smell of oil and steel still thick in the air. The Somme sat motionless now, an instrument of war waiting for the right battlefield. This was just the beginning. Clement was the first enemy, but not the last. If they wanted to change the army, they had to fight for it. And fight they would. 7. First report. 3 days. 3 long days of drills, maneuvers, and adjustments. 3 days of fighting not just the outdated doctrine of the French army, but also logistical problems that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. At first, everything had been running smoothly. The tank crews were improving, their coordination sharpening as they adjusted to maneuver warfare rather than slow infantry support. Even the skeptical officers had begun to see the advantages of speed over static positioning. Then the supply issues started. On the second day, fuel shipments arrived late. Mechanics who had been working on the Somua reported that certain parts were suddenly delayed due to a mix-up in logistics. Blank ammunition for the training exercises was rerouted to another unit without prior notice. Moreau knew exactly what was happening. Clement was tightening the noose. None of it was direct interference. It was death by 1,000 cuts. But they had adapted. Workarounds were found, alternative sources secured, and training continued. And now, he was walking toward Colonel Perrin's office, the finished report in hand. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots as he stepped into the administrative wing of the base. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ink, paper, and dust, the familiar atmosphere of military bureaucracy. A clerk at a small desk near the entrance glanced up. His uniform was neat but bore none of the wear of field duty, one of those officers who had never left the comfort of headquarters. Captain Moreau, the clerk greeted, adjusting his glasses. "Here to see Colonel Perrin?" "Yes," Moreau replied, holding up the folder. "Training report." The clerk gave a sympathetic look, as if he already knew that bringing reports to Perrin was never a pleasant experience. "He's inside. He just finished his morning briefings." Moreau nodded, stepping past the desk. He took a deep breath before knocking on the door. A gruff voice answered. "Enter." He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Colonel Jean Perrin sat at his desk, his broad frame hunched slightly as he flipped through a stack of reports. The morning sunlight filtered through the small window behind him, casting long shadows across the cluttered wooden surface. Moreau saluted. "Captain Moreau, reporting, sir." Perrin glanced up, setting aside his pen. His expression was unreadable. "Ah, Moreau, the tank enthusiast." The title wasn't entirely mocking, but neither was it complimentary. Moreau kept his face neutral. "The training report, sir," he said, stepping forward and placing the folder neatly on Perrin's desk. Perrin picked it up, flipping it open with a sigh. "I assume everything went smoothly?" Moreau hesitated for a fraction of a second. There were logistical complications, but the exercises were completed as scheduled. Perrin gave him a sharp look over the top of the folder. "Logistical complications?" Moreau kept his tone even. "Fuel delays, missing supplies, some rescheduled shipments." Perrin exhaled through his nose, flipping another page. "I see. And did you file complaints with the logistics office?" Moreau chose his words carefully. "No, sir. The issues were manageable, and I didn't want to slow down training." Perrin's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he returned to the report. He knew. Of course he knew. He had been in the army long enough to recognize the quiet sabotage of a political enemy. Moreau waited as Perrin skimmed through the pages of data, observations, and recommendations. "This is detailed," Perrin muttered, flipping to a section of technical analysis. "Performance assessments, fuel efficiency records, comparative speed tests. Most officers just send me a page or two of general remarks. I thought a full breakdown would be more useful, sir," Moreau replied. Perrin made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a chuckle. "Yes, yes. You and your kind love reports." That stung more than it should have. "Your kind." Moreau knew what he meant. He had read enough accounts of pre-war France to know that men like Perrin viewed the tank reformers, officers like de Gaulle, like Moreau himself, as theorists, dreamers, men who loved concepts more than the brutal reality of war. "Let's see," Perrin muttered as he reached the conclusions section. He frowned slightly. "You're suggesting an increase in high-speed maneuver drills?" "Yes, sir. The Somua S-35 performed significantly better when allowed to operate at full mobility. The Renaults were slower, but they were still more effective when moving rather than engaging from static positions." Perrin set the report down, rubbing his temples. "And you genuinely believe this kind of warfare will work in a real conflict?" Moreau knew this was the moment that mattered. "I do, sir," he said, keeping his voice firm but not arrogant. "The Germans are rearming. They are testing fast-moving, coordinated tank strategies in Spain. If we do not prepare for that kind of war, we will be at a disadvantage before the first shot is fired." Perrin exhaled slowly. "You assume, of course, that the next war will be mobile. You assume we won't be able to hold them at the borders. You assume they will bypass fixed defenses." Moreau's stomach twisted slightly. He knew they would. He had seen it happen in history. But he could not say that. "I believe, sir, that it is our duty to prepare for all possibilities, he said carefully. If we rely only on fixed defenses, we will become inflexible. And inflexibility loses wars. Perrin was silent for a long moment. He tapped his fingers on the edge of the report, his expression unreadable. You are ambitious, Moreau. Ambition can be dangerous in this army, he finally said. You're lucky that your report is well written and your exercises were conducted within regulations. Otherwise, I would have been forced to reprimand you. Moreau kept his posture straight. I understand, sir. Perrin sighed again and leaned back in his chair. Your training will continue, for now. But keep in mind. He fixed Moreau with a pointed look. You have made enemies. I don't have to tell you that. No, sir, Moreau replied. You don't. Good, Perrin muttered, closing the folder. Then you may go. Moreau saluted sharply before turning to leave. Just as he reached the door, Perrin spoke again. Moreau, he paused, glancing back. You've stirred the pot, Perrin said. Make sure you don't end up drowning in it. The warning was clear. With a quiet nod, Moreau stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind him. The morning sunlight hit his face as he stepped back into the open air. Renaud was waiting nearby, leaning against a jeep with his arms crossed. Well? Renaud asked, raising an eyebrow. Moreau exhaled slowly. The training continues. Renaud smirked. Looks like you survived the first battle, then. Moreau looked down at his hands, still holding a spare copy of the report. For now, he knew better than to believe this was over. The paperwork was done. The exercises had been justified. But Clement wasn't going to stop. 8. Beyond the barracks. The rhythmic rumble of the train beneath him was almost soothing. He leaned against the window, watching the French countryside roll by in a blur of green fields and distant hills. After days spent in the rigid, controlled world of the military where orders, reports, and discipline ruled every waking moment, stepping into civilian life felt like stepping into another world entirely. Verdun was a military town, but beyond its barracks and training fields lay a France deeply divided, a country caught between the ghosts of its past and the uncertainty of its future. Moreau had spent days buried in tank drills and training reports, pushing against the army's resistance to change. But today, he was stepping into a different kind of battlefield. Paris was still far from him, but even in smaller cities, the pulse of France's political unrest was impossible to ignore. The Third Republic, weakened by years of corruption, economic hardship, and ideological warfare, was fracturing under its own weight. He had seen the headlines. Le pays au bord du gouffre. The country on the brink. Le Front Populaire et les menaces communists. The Popular Front and the Communist threat. Les leagues d'extreme droite defiant le government. Far-right leagues challenged the government. France, like the rest of the world, was still clawing its way out of the economic devastation of the Great Depression. The Wall Street crash of 1929 had rippled across the Atlantic, shaking France's fragile economy, leading to mass layoffs, inflation, and waves of public unrest. Factories had closed, food prices had soared, and the political landscape had turned into a battlefield between socialists, conservatives, fascists, and communists. The government was weak, divided, struggling to maintain order as the streets filled with protests, riots, and strikes. Far-right paramilitary leagues like the Croix de Feu and the Action Française clashed with socialist and communist movements, turning Paris into a powder keg waiting to explode. And here he was, a soldier, stepping into the heart of it all. The station was crowded, filled with travelers, merchants, and working-class men heading home after long shifts. The smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery mixed with the sharp scent of coal smoke from the trains, a familiar yet strangely comforting blend of industry and tradition. Moreau adjusted his jacket as he stepped onto the cobblestone streets, breathing in the city air. He had spent so long surrounded by soldiers, by drills and tanks, that being among civilians almost felt foreign. The streets of Verdun were alive with movement market vendors shouting their prices, men reading newspapers at corner cafes, mothers pulling their children along hurriedly as if afraid of unseen dangers. But it was the voices of politics that filled the air the most. Near the town square, a group of young men stood on a raised wooden platform, handing out pamphlets with bold red lettering. One of them, a lean, sharp-faced man in his 20s, was giving an impassioned speech. The government is failing us. The politicians in Paris grow fat, while workers go hungry. The capitalist system is rotten. It must be torn down. Communists, Not far from them, on the opposite side of the square, another group gathered under a blue and white banner bearing the symbol of the Croix de Feu, a right-wing nationalist paramilitary group. Their leader, an older man with a trimmed mustache, spoke with calm authority. France is being weakened from within. Communists seek to destroy our traditions, our identity. The Republic is corrupt, overrun with traitors. The crowd was tense, divided, with people watching both sides warily. Some shouted in agreement, others in anger. Fights could break out at any moment. Moreau had read about this growing political instability, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. This wasn't just political debate, this was a nation tearing itself apart. A hand touched his shoulder. "Didn't expect to see you here, Capitaine." He turned, instantly recognizing Jean-Luc Martin, a former classmate from Saint Cyr Military Academy, now dressed in civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable posture of a military man. Moreau smirked. "Jean-Luc, what are you doing here?" "Escaping the madness of Paris for a few days," Jean-Luc sighed, adjusting his coat. "The streets there are worse than here. Riots nearly broke out last week. Everyone's waiting for the next government collapse." Moreau shook his head. "And the army?" Jean-Luc exhaled, lowering his voice. "Divided. Same as the country. You have officers who lean toward the left, others who sympathize with the right. It's getting to the point where people are wondering if the military will have to restore order eventually." That was dangerous talk. France had seen enough coups in its history. Moreau knew that if the instability continued, there would come a day when someone, a general, a politician, or even a group of radicals would try to seize power outright. Jean-Luc nodded toward the political speakers. "Which side do you think will win?" Moreau watched the two factions shouting at each other from across the square. "Neither," he said finally. "It's not the street fighters who win in the end. It's the ones pulling the strings behind them." Jean-Luc let out a bitter laugh. "That's what I thought." By the time the sun began to set, Moreau found himself at a small cafe tucked into the corner of a quiet street, away from the political madness of the town square. The place had a cozy warmth to it, the scent of fresh bread and coffee filling the air, the soft murmur of conversations making it feel detached from the chaos outside. He sat at a table near the window, a glass of red wine in front of him, watching as the city dimmed under the glow of gas lamps. A young woman moved between the tables, her auburn hair tied loosely behind her, an effortless grace in her movements. She placed a plate of cheese and bread in front of him without a word, then met his eyes with mild curiosity. "You're not from here," she said matter-of-factly. "Neither are you," he countered, noticing the faint accent in her voice, Parisian, not provincial. She smirked, wiping her hands on her apron. "I left Paris last year. Too many protests, too much anger. It felt like the city was about to tear itself apart." He took a sip of his wine. "It still might." Her expression turned thoughtful. "And what do you think will happen?" He hesitated, then said, "Nothing good." She nodded, as if that answer was expected. "You're a soldier." Moreau raised an eyebrow. "That obvious?" She glanced at his posture, his clean-shaven face, the way he instinctively watched the room without realizing it. "I have a good eye." He chuckled. "And what do you do here, besides serve wine and read people?" She smirked. "I listen. People talk when they drink. If you know how to listen, you can hear what's really happening before the newspapers print it." Moreau studied her for a moment. She wasn't just a cafe worker, she was someone who understood the undercurrents of France better than most. Maybe, in a time like this, that was more valuable than any military strategy. 9. The calm before the storm. The train ride back to the barracks was uneventful, but the memory of the past day lingered in his mind. The smell of the cafe's fresh bread and wine still clung to his senses, mixing with the memory of heated political debates in the streets. The woman at the cafe, he still didn't know her name, had left an impression, though he couldn't quite explain why. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She understood things, saw through people. And in a time where everyone was picking sides, that made her dangerous or valuable. As Verdun's military district came into view, the transition from civilian life to military rigidity was stark. The stone barracks stood tall and lifeless, rows of trucks and tanks parked with mechanical precision. The chaos of politics faded, replaced by the structured monotony of army life. Here, everything was meant to be predictable, but Moreau knew his life here was anything but predictable now. Stepping into the officers' quarters, Moreau dropped his bag onto his cot, stretching his shoulders. The room was sparse: a wooden desk, a small cabinet, a few personal items tucked away neatly. It lacked the warmth of the cafe, the hum of the city, the unpredictability of civilian life. But it was home, at least for now. He had barely settled when the door swung open. Renaud stepped inside, a cigarette already half-burned between his fingers. His uniform jacket was unbuttoned, his sleeves rolled up, a sign that he had been working or drinking or both. Well, look who's back, Renaud said, flicking ash onto the floor. Have a good time in the real world, or did you get tired of listening to civilians argue about the end of France? Moreau smirked. You sound jealous. Renaud scoffed, dropping onto the edge of Moreau's desk. Jealous? Please. I prefer my chaos organized. Civilians? No rules, no ranks, just pure madness. At least here, we know who's in charge. Moreau leaned against the wall, watching him. That's the problem, though, isn't it? We know who's in charge. Renaud exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. Murd. Don't start with that again. I just got back from a wonderful meeting with logistics. And you'll be thrilled to know that Clement has been very busy in your absence. Moreau straightened. What happened? Supplies have been reallocated, Renaud said, his voice laced with mock politeness. Your training exercises? Fuel rations cut by 20%. Blank rounds? Not enough available at the moment. Oh, and get this, the Somua? Scheduled for maintenance next week. Too unsafe to use, they say. Moreau's jaw clenched. Clement wasn't wasting any time. How much did Perrin approve, he asked. Hard to say, Renaud shrugged. But my guess? He's looking the other way. Clement is testing how far he can push before you start making noise. Moreau exhaled slowly. He had expected this, but the speed at which Clement was moving suggested something else. This wasn't just about shutting down his training. Clement wanted him out. All right, Moreau said, thinking quickly. Then we adapt. Less fuel? We run shorter drills with more precision. No blank rounds. We focus on movement drills instead. And the Somua? He smirked. Well, if it's too unsafe to use, we'll just have to train without it. See how well the Renauds can handle coordinated maneuvers. Renaud grinned. So we act like good little soldiers while making Clement look like an idiot. Something like that. Renaud nodded approvingly, taking another drag from his cigarette. I like it. Quiet resistance. Subtle. You sure you're not a politician? Moreau chuckled. No. Just someone who knows how to fight a war on more than one front. By morning, the changes were already in effect. The usual roar of tank engines was quieter, the movements more controlled. Instead of running long, fuel-draining maneuvers, Moreau had the crews practicing precise formations, quick directional changes, and rapid deployment. The blank ammunition shortage meant they worked with dry-fire drills, focusing on coordination and turret speed. If Clement wanted to cripple them through bureaucracy, Moreau would turn his obstacles into advantages. Halfway through the day, Sergeant Marchand approached him, his expression cautious. The man had been skeptical of Moreau's methods at first, but he had come to respect them. Sir, Marchand said, adjusting his helmet. The men are starting to ask questions. What kind of questions? Moreau asked. Marchand hesitated. They noticed the fuel cuts, the ammunition delays. Some are saying the high command doesn't want us training too hard. Moreau crossed his arms. And what do you think? Marchand glanced at the tanks, the crews working harder despite the restrictions. I think someone doesn't want us prepared. And that makes me nervous. Moreau studied him for a moment before nodding. Tell the men this: our job is to train, no matter the circumstances. Obstacles come and go. We work with what we have. Marchand nodded, but his face remained troubled. Sir, if war comes, and we're not ready because of politics. Moreau interrupted. Then we find a way. We always find a way. Marchand exhaled, nodding before stepping back to the training field. Renaud watched the exchange from a distance, shaking his head. They're starting to see the cracks, he muttered. Won't be long before the whole army does. Moreau kept his eyes on the men. That's what Clement is afraid of. That night, as Moreau sat at his desk reviewing training schedules, a folded note was received by him. He opened it up cautiously, recognizing the handwriting immediately. The woman from the cafe. He unfolded it carefully. You left in a hurry, Captain. I was hoping for a better conversation next time. If you find yourself in town again, I'll be waiting. No signature. No name. Just an invitation. He smirked slightly, setting the note down. The world outside the barracks was still there, still waiting. A world beyond tanks, beyond training, beyond the looming war. For now, though, his battlefield remained here. and the war with Clement had only just begun. 10. Fault lines. The air inside the officers' mess was thick with the scent of pipe smoke, cheap wine, and the lingering musk of unwashed uniforms. The room was filled with men of different ranks, drinking, arguing, and playing cards as the oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the wooden walls. It was the heart of the army's social life, a place where alliances were made, grudges were held, and words cut deeper than bayonets. Moreau sat at a corner table, Renaud across from him, shuffling a deck of cards. A bottle of Bordeaux rested between them, already half empty. The mood around the room was loud, boisterous, but there was something different tonight, a tension beneath the laughter, a feeling that everyone was waiting for something to snap. "You hear what happened to Captain Lefebvre?" Renaud asked, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. Moreau picked up his glass, swirling the wine slowly. "No, transferred." He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Renaud smirked. "Officially, poor leadership. Unofficially, he spoke a little too much about how this army is stuck in the last war." Moreau exhaled slowly. It was starting. The slow, methodical purge of officers who thought differently, who didn't fit the mold of the old-school command. Clement wasn't just sabotaging training. He was working to make sure only the right men were left in positions of influence. "Who replaced him?" Moreau asked. "Some old-school bastard. A real miraculist. One of those officers who still worship Pétain like he's the second coming of Napoleon." Moreau scoffed. "So another idiot who thinks trenches are the future?" "Exactly," Renaud muttered, setting down his cards. "They're stacking the deck, Moreau. It's not just Clement. It's bigger than him. The old guard isn't just resisting change, they're making sure it never comes." Before Moreau could respond, a group of officers nearby started getting louder. He recognized the men: Lieutenant Gerard, Captain Rousseau, and a few others who had always carried an air of smug superiority. They were men who had spent more time in Parisian salons than on actual battlefields, officers who loved the uniform but not the responsibility. Gerard, already flushed from too much wine, slammed his glass down. "Murd, you know what the problem is? It's all these so-called modern thinkers who don't understand French war doctrine." Rousseau leaned in, grinning. "Ah yes, our proud tradition of standing still and getting shot." The men at the table laughed, but Gerard waved a dismissive hand. "We won the last war, didn't we? And how? By holding the line. By letting the Boches bleed themselves dry." Another officer chimed in, nodding. "Exactly. This nonsense about maneuver warfare, what is it? Some Anglo-German fantasy. France doesn't need to maneuver. France is the wall. We don't move for anyone." Moreau clenched his jaw. This was the arrogance that would kill them. The belief that because they had won in 1918, they would win again with the same tactics, the same mindset. Gerard wasn't finished. "You know what else is the problem? These new officers, they think they can change the army. They think they're smarter than the men who won the war." His eyes flickered toward Moreau. "That's the real danger. A bunch of young intellectuals who would rather play with theories than understand real war." Moreau knew that was aimed at him. He took a slow sip of wine before setting his glass down. "You call it playing with theories. I call it learning from mistakes." Gerard raised an eyebrow, grinning. "Mistakes? The only mistake is questioning what already works. This army doesn't need some grand reinvention, Moreau. It needs men who understand that victory is about discipline, endurance, and sacrifice, not speed." Moreau leaned back, letting the silence linger for a second before replying. "Sacrifice." He let the word hang in the air. "Is that what you call the thousands of men who were slaughtered at Verdun because our officers couldn't think beyond throwing more bodies into the trenches?" The laughter at Gerard's table died instantly. Rousseau coughed awkwardly, shifting in his seat. A few officers looked away, suddenly very interested in their drinks. But Gerard's face darkened, his fingers tightening around his glass. "You think you're clever, Moreau," he said, voice quieter now. "You think you're better than the men who bled for this country?" Moreau held his gaze. "No, I think they deserved better leaders." A heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone was watching now. Gerard pushed back his chair. "You little." Before he could stand, Renaud's voice cut in smoothly. "Easy there, Gerard. No need to embarrass yourself in front of all these witnesses." Gerard's jaw twitched. He knew what that meant. If he started something here, it would go in the reports. Rousseau, ever the politician, put a hand on Gerard's arm. "Come on, let's not ruin the night. We're all on the same side, aren't we?" Gerard hesitated before sitting back down, but his glare stayed locked on Moreau. Watch yourself, Moreau. The army doesn't have patience for officers who think they know better than their superiors. Moreau smirked slightly. Then maybe the army should start listening more. Renaud grabbed the bottle of wine and stood. All right, I think we've overstayed our welcome. As they left the mess, stepping into the cool night air, Renaud shook his head. You really love making friends, don't you? Moreau exhaled. It's not about friends. It's about making sure they know they can't just talk like that unchallenged. Renaud chuckled. Well, mission accomplished. You've got Gerard's attention. And probably Clement's too, by now. Moreau looked up at the stars. Let them watch. I'm not stopping. Renaud sighed, lighting another cigarette. Murd. You really are a stubborn bastard, you know that. Moreau just smiled. Inside the mess, the drinking continued, the laughter resumed. But the fault lines were showing. The army wasn't just divided between old and new. It was divided between those who believed France could change and those who clung desperately to the past. And Moreau knew that when the time came, it wouldn't just be the enemy they had to fight. It would be the men standing beside them. 11. Summon. The cafe had a different energy at night. The usual daytime crowd, workers grabbing a quick meal, merchants counting their earnings, had been replaced by a quieter, more observant clientele. Some men sat in groups, speaking in hushed tones about politics, the army, or the price of bread. Others sat alone, nursing their wine, listening more than they spoke. Étienne Moreau had learned a long time ago that a place like this wasn't just for drinking. It was for listening. He sat at his usual table near the window, his coat draped over the back of his chair. The wine in his glass was dark and rich, the bottle beside it half empty. Across from him sat the woman from the cafe, her expression unreadable as she rested her chin on her hand. You're early this time, she said, watching him with a faint smirk. You almost sound disappointed, Moreau replied, taking a sip of his wine. She shrugged. I thought soldiers like to keep people waiting. Or maybe just officers do. Only when there's a reason for it. And tonight. Moreau exhaled, glancing out the window. The streets outside were quiet, but in the distance, he could still hear the occasional burst of shouting, some political argument. Maybe a drunk nationalist yelling about the Republic. The usual. Tonight, he said finally. I wanted to remind myself that the world outside the barracks still exists. She studied him for a moment, then reached for the wine bottle and poured herself a glass. So you do know how to relax. I was starting to think you were just another officer with a stick up his ass. Moreau chuckled. Most of them are. I try to be different. And why is that? He considered the question, swirling the wine in his glass. Because I don't want to be like them. Her gaze didn't waver. And what are they like? Moreau leaned back slightly. Blind. Stubborn. Convinced that because they won the last war, they'll win the next one the same way. She smirked, tilting her head. So you're saying we're going to lose? No, Moreau said. I'm saying we don't have to. But we will if people like Clement get their way. At the mention of the name, something in her expression shifted. Clement, she repeated. The major who doesn't like you very much? Moreau raised an eyebrow. You've been asking around. She smiled, sipping her wine. Like I said last time, people talk when they drink. And your name has come up more than once. Moreau exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. I hope they're saying good things. That depends on who's talking, she said, setting her glass down. Some of your fellow officers think you're arrogant. A troublemaker. Someone who doesn't respect tradition. And what do you think? She studied him for a moment before replying. I think you're a man who knows he's right, but hasn't figured out how to prove it yet. Moreau chuckled, shaking his head. You make it sound like I have a choice. Don't you? He hesitated, then shook his head again. Not really. If I stay quiet, nothing changes. If I push too hard, I get crushed. So I walk a fine line and hope it holds. She tilted her head slightly. And if it doesn't? Moreau met her gaze. Then I find another way. The conversation was interrupted by the cafe doors swinging open. The relaxed atmosphere shifted instantly as Renaud strode inside, his usual smirk replaced by something more serious. Moreau immediately knew something was wrong. Renaud wasn't drunk. He wasn't grinning like an idiot, ready to make some joke about Moreau sneaking off to see a woman. He was focused, sharp, urgent. Moreau set his glass down as Renaud approached. You look like hell, he said casually. You need to come with me, Renaud said, ignoring the remark. Moreau frowned. What happened? You've been summoned, Renaud said. Paris. Immediately, Moreau felt his stomach tighten. By who? The disciplinary committee. The entire cafe went quiet. The woman across from him raised an eyebrow, watching the exchange with mild curiosity. Disciplinary committee? That doesn't sound good. Moreau exhaled slowly, his mind already racing. Clement. This was him. Renaud pulled a folded letter from his coat pocket and tossed it onto the table. It's official. They're calling you in for insubordination and improper conduct. Moreau picked up the letter and skimmed it. The language was vague, carefully worded to be just threatening enough. A summons to the military offices in Paris, signed by the committee's chairman. No details, just a demand for his presence. This is bullshit, Renaud muttered, crossing his arms. Clement must have pulled strings. He couldn't shut you down in Verdun, so he's bringing you to Paris to do it. Moreau set the letter down carefully, rubbing his temple. It was a move straight out of the army's political playbook. If they couldn't get rid of him through reports, they would bury him in bureaucracy, accusations, and vague disciplinary actions. The woman leaned back in her chair, watching the scene unfold. You must be more important than I thought. Moreau smirked. Or just more of a problem. She tilted her head slightly. And what happens if they decide you really are a problem? Moreau glanced down at the letter again, then back at her. Then I find another way. She smiled slightly, raising her glass. You really don't know how to quit, do you? No, Moreau admitted. I don't. Renaud sighed, rubbing his face. All right, lovebirds. As much as I'd love to let you two keep flirting, we need to move. The train leaves in an hour. Moreau chuckled, standing up and adjusting his coat. Don't worry, Renaud. You're still my favorite. Renaud rolled his eyes. Lucky me. The woman stayed seated, watching them with that same knowing expression. Be careful in Paris, Capitaine. I have a feeling you're going to need all the luck you can get. Moreau nodded once. I'll be back. She smirked. I'll believe it when I see it. As Moreau followed Renaud out into the night, the warmth of the cafe faded behind him, replaced by the cold, quiet air of the empty streets. Paris was waiting, and so was Clement. 12. The train to Paris. Somewhere between Verdun and Paris. The train rattled along the tracks, its rhythmic clatter filling the dimly lit compartment. Outside, the French countryside rolled by under the pale moonlight, fields stretching into the horizon, broken only by the occasional distant glow of village lanterns. Moreau sat by the window, arms crossed, staring into the darkness. He wasn't looking at the scenery. He was thinking. Across from him, Renaud exhaled loudly, rubbing his face before reaching into his coat for a cigarette. He lit it with practiced ease, inhaling deeply before glancing at Moreau. You haven't said a word since we left Verdun. Moreau barely moved. I've been thinking. Renaud let out a tired chuckle. That's dangerous. Moreau smirked faintly, but his mind was elsewhere. The committee, the accusation, Clement. It was all playing out exactly as he'd expected, just faster than he thought it would. Renaud leaned back, resting his boots on the empty seat beside him. All right, let's hear it. What's going on in that overly complicated brain of yours? Moreau took a slow breath, his voice calm but firm. This isn't just about me, Renaud. This is bigger. Renaud raised an eyebrow. Of course it's bigger. Clement wants you gone. The old guard wants men like you silenced before you start infecting others with ideas. Moreau shook his head. It's not just Clement. It's the entire structure of this army. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. We're being set up to fail, and they don't even realize it. Renaud took another drag, watching him. Go on. Moreau tapped his fingers against his knee, his mind drifting back to another life, another time. He had studied all this before the mistakes of the French military, the political infighting, the arrogance that would lead to disaster. The last war broke them, Moreau said quietly. Not just physically, but mentally. The men in charge now, they were junior officers back then, watching their friends get slaughtered by the thousands in the trenches. And the lesson they took from that war wasn't, we must adapt. It was, never again. Renaud nodded slowly. Which is why they're obsessed with defense. The Maginot Line. The idea that if we just sit tight, the Boches will break themselves against us again. Moreau glanced at him. Exactly. They think they're being pragmatic, but they're really being reactionary. They're so afraid of repeating the past that they're blind to the future. Renaud tapped ash onto the floor, his expression darkening. So what? You think the Germans are actually coming? Everyone in Paris keeps saying Hitler is just posturing. Moreau scoffed. Of course they do. They said the same about Napoleon before he marched across Europe. They said the same about the Germans before 1914. People always think they have more time than they do. He stared out the window, his voice quieter now. I read the reports, Renaud. The Germans are rearming fast. They're running military exercises under the guise of police training. Their industries are shifting back into war production, and no one is stopping them. Meanwhile, we're still debating whether tanks should move faster than infantry. Renaud sighed, shaking his head. Murd. Moreau smirked faintly. Exactly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The train rumbled on, the dim glow of the overhead lamps casting long shadows in the compartment. Finally, Renaud broke the silence. All right, so where does this lead? Moreau exhaled. To disaster. Renaud gave a bitter chuckle. Great. That's reassuring. Moreau leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. We're heading toward another war, Renaud. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not next year. But it's coming. And when it does, we won't be ready. Renaud frowned, watching him carefully. And you think this committee hearing is part of that? Moreau nodded. I think it's a symptom of the disease. Clement and men like him aren't acting out of malice. They're acting out of fear. They want to control the army, keep it rigid, because they think control equals stability. But what they're really doing is weakening it. They're silencing officers who think differently. They're shutting down discussions that challenge doctrine. They're rewarding obedience over competence. He leaned back, shaking his head. When the war comes, they won't just lose. They won't even understand why they're losing. Renaud took another long drag, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling. You know, Moreau, sometimes I forget you're not just some stubborn ass with a talent for pissing off senior officers. Moreau smirked. And what am I then? A fucking historian, Renaud muttered, shaking his head. You talk about this army like you already read the book on how it collapses. Moreau didn't answer, because in a way, he had. He could still remember reading about it: the fall of France, the Blitzkrieg, the collapse in just 6 weeks. The sheer disbelief on the faces of French generals when they realized their army, the one they thought was invincible, had been outmaneuvered and shattered. It was like watching a train hurtling toward a broken bridge, screaming at the passengers to jump before it was too late, but no one listening. Renaud studied him for a moment, then leaned forward. All right, historian. So what do we do about it? Moreau was silent for a moment. We survive. Renaud snorted. That's it. That's your brilliant strategy. It's the only strategy, Moreau said. We survive long enough to be in the right place at the right time. The army isn't ready to change, but it will be once it starts losing. And when that moment comes, I want to be in a position where I can actually do something about it. Renaud sighed, rubbing his face. Murd. I liked it better when I just had to worry about Clement. Moreau chuckled. Clement is just a footnote in a much bigger story. Try telling that to the disciplinary committee, Renaud muttered. The train began to slow, the distant lights of Paris coming into view through the window. Moreau glanced outside. The city looked the same as ever, grand, timeless, full of life. But beneath it, he knew, things were shifting. The politicians were too busy fighting each other to see it. The generals were too comfortable in their positions to prepare for it. And the people, the ordinary men and women, had no idea what was coming. Moreau took a deep breath. 13. The machinery of the Republic. April 1934. Paris, France. The train pulled into Gare de l'Est just as the sun began to rise over the city. The golden light spilled across the iron tracks, catching on the soot-covered stone walls of the station. Even at this early hour, Paris was alive. Moreau stepped onto the platform, the weight of his travel bag slung over his shoulder, Renaud following close behind. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, damp stone, and stale bread from the food stalls lining the terminal's outer corridors. Paris, the city of history, power, and decay. To most, it was still the beating heart of France, the cultural and political center of the Republic. But Moreau had read too much history, seen too many reports, to be blinded by nostalgia. The reality of Paris in 1934 was something far different than the romantic postcards and poetry. The streets outside the station were crowded, restless, and tense. Horse-drawn carts still shared space with motor cars, their wooden wheels clattering loudly over the cobblestones. Men in worn-out coats huddled near alleyways, clutching newspapers filled with stories of economic struggle and political division. Women walked briskly through the streets, clutching their handbags tightly, as if expecting something or someone to snatch them away. Overhead, elegant Haussmannian buildings lined the avenues, their pristine facades disguising the crumbling apartments within. For all its beauty, Paris was breaking under the weight of its own contradictions: rich and poor, tradition and modernity, stability and revolution. Christ, Renault muttered, stretching his arms as he took in the chaos. You'd think the whole city is waiting for a riot. Moreau smirked. That's because it is. Paris wasn't just the capital of France, it was a battlefield. In the distance, near the Place de la République, Moreau spotted a group of leftist demonstrators gathering, waving red flags and shouting slogans against the government. Not far from them, a contingent of police stood in a tight formation, hands resting uneasily on their batons. And just a few streets away, near the Boulevard Saint-Michel, a different kind of crowd was forming, nationalists in dark blue uniforms, their croix de feu banners fluttering in the wind. Two sides, two Francis, and somewhere in the middle, a government barely holding the republic together. Tensions croissants entre la droite et la gauche. Growing tensions between right and left. Grèves et manifestations paralysant la capitale. Strikes and demonstrations paralyzed the capital. Le government put il survivor. Can the government survive? Renault scoffed. Same headlines as last month. Probably the same headlines next month. Moreau grabbed a copy, tossing a few coins to the vendor before tucking it under his arm. And yet, one day, one of these headlines will be the last. Renault shot him a look. Murd, Moreau. You could at least pretend to be optimistic. Moreau smirked. I could, but I'd be lying. The Ministère de la Guerre was an imposing structure of stone, steel, and bureaucracy, its entrance guarded by two uniformed men who barely glanced at them as they passed. The air inside was thick with the scent of paper, ink, and dust, the unmistakable stench of government. Rows of officers and clerks moved through the corridors, carrying stacks of documents that seemed far heavier than their actual weight. Typewriters clicked in nearby rooms, creating a mechanical rhythm that underscored the quiet, tired voices of men discussing strategy, logistics, and political maneuvering. The waiting room for disciplinary hearings was just as dreary as Moreau expected. Wooden benches, beige walls, a single clock ticking slowly above a desk, where an overworked secretary shuffled through files. Moreau and Renault approached the desk. The secretary, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips, barely looked up. "Nom," he muttered, already reaching for a file. "Captain Moreau," Moreau said, handing over his summons. The secretary took the paper, scanning it briefly before sighing. You." Moreau raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound promising." The secretary snorted. "It's not." He reached for a stamp and slammed it onto a piece of paper. A loud, final sound. Moreau watched him carefully. "How bad is it?" The secretary shrugged, pulling a fresh cigarette from his pocket and lighting it. "Bad enough that your name has been floating around the building all morning, but not bad enough to get you dismissed outright." Moreau smirked. "That's something, at least." The man exhaled a cloud of smoke. "Not really." He gestured toward the door down the hall. "You're expected. Go in when called." Renault leaned in, lowering his voice. "Any idea who's on the panel?" The secretary eyed him, then sighed. 3 officers. Colonel Lemoyne, General Bresson, and Major Clement. Moreau exhaled through his nose. So Clement was on the panel. Of course he was. The secretary must have noticed the shift in his expression because he gave a humorless chuckle. "You pissed off the wrong people, Capitaine. I'd start practicing how to grovel if I were you." Moreau smirked. "Not my style." The secretary shook his head. "Then I hope you like paperwork and isolation in some forgotten outpost." Moreau took a seat in the waiting area, stretching his legs out as he listened to the muffled voices from inside the hearing room. He could picture it now: a long wooden table, a row of officers in stiff uniforms, stacks of reports sitting beside them like weapons. Renault sat beside him, arms crossed. "So, what's the strategy?" Moreau exhaled slowly. "That depends." "On what?" "On how much of this is just a warning, and how much of it is an actual execution." Renault frowned. "They wouldn't discharge you for this." Moreau smirked. "No, but they'd love to make my life miserable. An administrative post in the colonies. A temporary reassignment that never ends. Maybe even just enough paperwork to drown me, so I don't have time to train my men." Renault rubbed his face. "Murd. Bureaucracy is worse than bullets." Moreau chuckled. "Not always. But in the right hands, it's just as deadly." The door to the hearing room creaked open, and a stern-looking adjutant stepped out, scanning the waiting area. "Captain Moreau," he called. Moreau stood, adjusting his uniform. Renault gave him a pat on the shoulder. "Try not to say anything too clever." Moreau smirked. I make no promises. He stepped forward, the door closing behind him with a solid, final thud. 14. The hearing. The door shut behind him with a solid thud, the sound reverberating in the high-ceilinged room like a judge's gavel. The hearing chamber was nothing grand as simple, starkly furnished room in the Ministry of War, with a long wooden table at its center. 3 officers sat behind it, their expressions ranging from disinterested to outright hostile. At the center was Colonel Lemoyne, a man in his 50s, his thinning gray hair neatly combed, his uniform crisp, his demeanor one of controlled irritation. To his left sat General Bresson, a thick-necked officer who had likely never missed a meal or a chance to enforce tradition. And to the right, Clement. Moreau had expected it, but seeing Clement sitting there, his cold eyes scanning the room like a predator waiting for his moment to strike, made it clear that this wasn't a hearing. It was an ambush. Moreau saluted sharply, stepping forward with practiced ease. Captain Étienne Moreau, reporting as ordered. Lemoyne barely looked up from the documents in front of him. Take a seat, Captain. Moreau sat, keeping his posture straight but not rigid. Too much stiffness could be mistaken for nerves, and he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. Lemoyne flipped a page, adjusting his glasses. You are aware of why you are here. Moreau knew the game they were playing. They weren't interested in explanations or defenses. This was about control, about forcing him to acknowledge their authority before they decided his fate. Still, he played his part. I was informed that the committee has concerns regarding my conduct and my approach to training exercises. Lemoyne exhaled, finally looking up. Concerns, indeed. He slid a document forward. Do you recognize this report, Captain? Moreau glanced at it. He didn't need to read it to know what it was. Clement's formal complaint against him. I do, sir, he replied evenly. Lemoyne nodded, his expression unreadable. It describes a pattern of behavior that is, to put it bluntly, troubling. Deviation from standard training doctrine, excessive emphasis on independent tank maneuvers, disregard for established procedures. It paints a picture of an officer who believes himself above his superiors. Would you say this report is accurate? Moreau didn't even glance at Clement, but he could feel the man's eyes on him. Waiting. With respect, sir, Moreau said, keeping his tone firm but not defiant. It is not accurate. It is a selective interpretation of my actions, presented to serve a narrative rather than reflect the reality of our training exercises. Bresson scoffed. So you're saying your superior officer fabricated this report? Moreau's jaw tightened slightly. I am saying that my training exercises followed regulations. They were approved. The results speak for themselves. Lemoyne tapped a finger against the desk. And yet, the officer who filed this report, a decorated veteran, a man with years of experience, seems to believe otherwise. That's quite an accusation to make against Major Clement. There it was. They weren't just questioning his methods. They were daring him to challenge Clement outright. Moreau chose his words carefully. I have nothing but respect for Major Clement's service, he said smoothly. But doctrine is not infallible, sir. Wars change. The battlefield changes. If our training does not adapt, we risk repeating past mistakes. Bresson's nostrils flared. And what mistakes would those be, Captain? Moreau met his gaze evenly. The assumption that the next war will be fought like the last. That tanks exist only to support infantry. That our strategy should be built entirely around defensive lines. History tells us that static defenses can be bypassed. That war favors those who move, who think, who adapt. Clement finally spoke, his voice sharp and cold. And you consider yourself one of those men, Captain? Moreau turned to face him, keeping his expression neutral. I consider myself an officer who wants France to win the next war, sir. A brief silence fell over the room. Clement leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Captain, are you implying that your superiors' men who have dedicated their lives to this army are incapable of winning the next war? Moreau refused to take the bait. I am saying, sir, that our doctrines should serve the future, not the past. Bresson let out a sharp laugh. Listen to him. The professor soldier, teaching us about war like we haven't lived through it. Moreau stayed silent, letting the insult pass. They wanted a reaction. He wouldn't give them one. Lemoyne exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple. Captain Moreau, I won't waste time arguing theory. The fact remains that you have been accused of insubordination, of operating outside the expectations set by your command structure. Whether or not your ideas have merit is not the question here. The question is whether you understand your place in this army. Moreau sat perfectly still. He knew the answer they wanted. Yes, sir. I understand my place. I will obey orders without question. I will abandon independent thought and do exactly as I am told. But if he said that, they would win. He chose his words carefully. I understand that my place, sir, is to serve France, to ensure that when the time comes, we are ready. Lemoyne stared at him for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair. Very well. He looked down at his papers again, tapping a pen against them. Your record is clean. Your training reports, despite the concerns, have shown improved performance among your men. And, much to the frustration of some, you have technically followed regulations. Clement's expression darkened. He hadn't expected this. Lemoyne continued. Given the circumstances, this committee will not pursue further disciplinary action at this time. Moreau kept his expression neutral, but internally, he exhaled slowly. Lemoyne fixed him with a sharp gaze. However, let me be clear. You are an officer of this army, not a theorist in a university lecture hall. You will follow orders. You will respect the chain of command. And you will tread carefully, Captain, because I assure you, should we receive another report like this one, the outcome will not be so lenient. Moreau saluted. Understood, sir. Lemoyne nodded. Dismissed. Moreau stood, turned, and walked toward the door without hesitation. Just as he reached it, Clement's voice cut through the air. Enjoy your victory while it lasts, Moreau. We'll see how long it takes before you finally learn your place. Moreau paused for only a fraction of a second before stepping through the door, his expression unreadable. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. 15. A conversation in the upper rooms. The restaurant wasn't the kind of place where officers usually gathered. It was a small, unassuming bistro tucked into the side of a quiet street, just a short walk from the Seine. The air inside smelled of buttered escargots, roasted duck, and red wine, the kind of warmth and indulgence that made men forget, for a moment, that the world outside was crumbling. Moreau sat across from Renaud, his coat draped over the chair, his fork idly pushing a piece of veal across his plate. He should have been hungry, but his mind was elsewhere. You haven't even touched your food, Renaud muttered, slicing through his steak with the precision of a man who had learned to savor the rare moments of good living. Moreau smirked faintly, picking up his glass. I'm eating. No, you're thinking. Moreau took a sip of wine instead of answering. Renaud shook his head. We should be celebrating. You just walked out of that hearing without so much as a reprimand. You survived. Moreau exhaled. For now, Renaud scoffed. Murd. You really can't enjoy a moment, can you? Before Moreau could reply, a shadow fell over the table. A young soldier stood at attention, his uniform crisp, his expression carefully neutral. Captain Moreau. Moreau set his glass down. Yes. The soldier hesitated before speaking. Colonel Lemoyne requests your presence. Upstairs. Renaud raised an eyebrow, looking between Moreau and the soldier. That didn't take long. Moreau wiped his mouth with his napkin and stood. Enjoy the rest of your meal. Renaud smirked. Don't start a war without me. Moreau followed the soldier toward the upper rooms of the restaurant, past the main dining hall, up a narrow wooden staircase. The sound of laughter and music faded behind him, replaced by the soft creak of floorboards and the distant noise of the city outside. At the end of the hallway, a single door stood slightly ajar. The soldier knocked once. Captain Moreau is here, sir. A voice from inside. Let him in. The soldier stepped aside. Moreau entered. The room was small, dimly lit by a single oil lamp on the desk. Colonel Lemoyne sat in a leather chair, a glass of brandy in his hand, a cigar burning in an ashtray nearby. He looked up as Moreau entered, his expression unreadable. Sit down, Captain. Moreau took the chair opposite him, waiting. Lemoyne swirled the brandy in his glass, watching it as though it held the answers to something greater. You know, he began, his tone casual, almost conversational. There was a time when this country belonged to men of action. Not politicians, not bureaucrats, men who knew how to bend the world to their will. Moreau said nothing. This wasn't about politics. It was a test. Lemoyne leaned forward slightly. There was once a soldier. Young. Ambitious. He was brilliant, of course. But intelligence alone was not what set him apart. No, it was something else. He took a slow sip of his drink. This man had no great family name to rely on. No powerful allies. And yet, within a few years, he had every general, every politician, every king watching him. Not because of his rank, but because of his reputation. Lemoyne looked directly at Moreau now, his gaze sharp. Do you know what made him so dangerous? Moreau held his stare. He understood people. Lemoyne smiled faintly. Exactly. He set the glass down. He did not lecture men. He did not debate them. He did not waste time convincing them that he was right. He made them believe it on their own. Moreau remained silent, letting the words settle. Lemoyne exhaled. And so he rose. Not just through battle, but through charm, through presence, through the force of reputation. He did not need to prove himself with words. His name carried more weight than his arguments ever could. A beat of silence. Then Lemoyne leaned back, resting his hands on the armrests. Tell me, Captain, do you think you are as charming as him? Moreau's lips curled into a smirk. I wouldn't know, sir. You haven't given me much of a chance to charm you yet. Lemoyne chuckled, shaking his head. Clever. But cleverness is not enough. His tone turned sharper. You're intelligent, Moreau. That much is obvious. But intelligence is present. Reputation is future. He picked up his cigar, rolling it between his fingers. You may be right about the army, about doctrine, about what's coming. But tell me, why should anyone follow you? Moreau exhaled through his nose. Because I'm right. Lemoyne let out a low laugh. And you think that's enough? Moreau's smirk faded slightly. Lemoyne nodded, as if confirming something. That soldier, the one I was telling you about, he was right too. But the world didn't follow him because of that. It followed him because he made them believe in him, not just in his ideas. Lemoyne leaned forward, his eyes locked on Moreau. That man's name was Napoleon Bonaparte. The name hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Moreau didn't move, but he felt the seriousness of the conversation shift. Lemoyne tilted his head slightly. Do you think you're as reputable as Napoleon? Moreau met his gaze, thinking carefully. He could say no. He could say yes. But both answers would be the wrong ones. So instead, he said, not yet. Lemoyne smiled slightly, as if that was the answer he had been waiting for. He sat back. Good. Then you understand the real challenge ahead of you. Moreau exhaled slowly. I take it this conversation isn't just about history. Lemoyne smirked. Everything is about history, Captain. You just have to know where to look. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Lemoyne picked up his glass again. You're dismissed. Moreau stood, giving a sharp salute before turning toward the door. Just as he reached it, Lemoyne spoke again. Moreau. Moreau paused. Lemoyne took a slow sip of brandy, then said, almost lazily, try not to lose your head before you even get a chance to build your legend. Moreau smirked. I'll do my best, sir. 16. Sudden explosion. April 1934, Verdun, France. The truck rumbled over the dirt road, sending up small clouds of dust as it carried Moreau and Renault back toward the barracks. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky in Meuse region, where battlefields of the last war still bore the scars of trenches and artillery craters. The ride was quiet. The trip of Paris made him question many things. Moreau sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring out at the endless countryside. Verdun felt different after Paris. The capital had been loud, restless, alive in a way that felt like it was about to tear itself apart. Verdun, by contrast, was discipline, routine, order. You still thinking about what Lemoyne said? Renault finally broke the silence, eyes on the road ahead as he drove. Moreau exhaled slowly. You don't just forget a conversation like that. Renault smirked. The Napoleon talk. Bet that got in your head. Moreau tilted his head slightly. It wasn't about Napoleon. It was about me. About whether I can get men to follow me before I even have power. Renault chuckled. So what? Are you suddenly worried you're not charismatic enough? Moreau smirked. No. I'm wondering if I've been going about this the wrong way. Renault lit a cigarette with one hand, his other still on the wheel. You don't say? You mean insulting senior officer in front of an entire disciplinary panel isn't the best way to win people over? Moreau chuckled, shaking his head. You have a way of simplifying things. That's because the world's simple, Moreau. You make it complicated. Moreau glanced at him. Is that so? Renault exhaled a plume of smoke. Look, you're right about the army being stuck in the past. Everyone with a brain knows it. The problem isn't your ideas. It's that you act like people should listen just because you're right. He tapped the cigarette against the dashboard. They won't. Moreau leaned back in his seat. I know. You sure? Because Lemoyne just spelled it out for you. Moreau sighed. It's not about convincing men like Clement. It's about making sure when the time comes, people trust me enough to follow me without questioning. Renault smirked. That's the first smart thing you've said all day. The truck rolled past the outer gates of the barracks, the familiar sight of rows of tanks, training fields, and soldiers moving between buildings coming into view. It was a world of order, where men followed orders because they had to, not because they wanted to. And if Moreau was going to change anything, that had to change first. For the next few days, life at the barracks resumed as normal, at least on the surface. Moreau returned to his duties, overseeing tank training, reviewing logistics, adjusting drills to keep up with the new restrictions Clement had put in place. Fuel was still being rationed, supplies still arriving late, but Moreau had anticipated this. Adapting was part of the game. The men noticed. Even the sergeants who had once been skeptical of him had begun to recognize that Moreau wasn't just pushing theory. He was making them better. Sergeant Marchand, one of the most vocal skeptics, approached Moreau one afternoon as drills concluded. "Sir," Marchand said, wiping sweat from his brow, his uniform still covered in dust from the latest exercise. "I don't know what you said in Paris, but something's changed." Moreau raised an eyebrow. "Changed how?" Marchand exhaled. "The men talk. They see you pushing back against Clement's bullshit. Some of them like it. Some of them don't. But either way, they're watching." Moreau crossed his arms. "And you?" Marchand hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I was wrong about you, sir. That's all I'll say." That was enough. Moreau didn't need admiration. He needed trust. 3 days later, an explosion shattered the morning calm. Moreau had been in his office, reviewing training schedules, when the sound ripped through the barracks, a deep, heavy blast followed by the unmistakable roar of fire. For a moment, everything was still. Then came the shouting. Moreau was already moving, grabbing his coat and racing toward the training fields before the smoke had even fully risen. When he arrived, the scene was chaos. One of the Renault tanks was on fire, thick black smoke billowing into the air as soldiers scrambled to contain the blaze. Nearby, a man lay on the ground, his leg bloody and twisted, his face pale with shock. "Get that fire out," Moreau barked as he pushed through the gathered crowd. "Medic now." The injured soldier, a young private, barely more than a recruit, was already being tended to by a field medic. His face was contorted in pain, his uniform torn from the blast. Moreau turned to Sergeant Marchand, who had been leading the exercise. "What happened?" Marchand shook his head, his jaw tight. "We were running a standard maneuver, sir. Nothing unusual. Then the engine, it just went. No warning. 1 second it was running fine, the next, boom." Moreau narrowed his eyes. Something wasn't right. He turned to the wreckage, stepping closer as the flames were finally brought under control. The Renault was completely gutted, its armor blackened and warped from the heat. Could it have been mechanical failure? Renault asked, appearing beside him. Moreau exhaled slowly, running his fingers over the side of the wreckage. His gut told him no. A tank engine failing usually sputtered, struggled, groaned before dying. This was too sudden, too precise. Then he saw it. Near the engine block, just beneath the warped metal, a small twist of copper wire, partially melted but still recognizable. Moreau's stomach tightened. Renault saw it too, his expression darkening. "Murd, you think?" Moreau clenched his jaw. This wasn't an accident. Renault let out a low curse, glancing over his shoulder. The men were still shaken, murmuring among themselves. No one had noticed what Moreau had found. Moreau straightened, keeping his voice low. "We don't say anything yet. Not until we know for sure." Renault exhaled through his nose. "And what if we already do?" Moreau's gaze drifted back to the ruined tank, the smoke still curling into the sky. "If this was sabotage," he said quietly, "then someone wanted to send a message." He turned back toward the barracks, his mind already racing. The question was, who? And how many more messages would come before he found out? 17. Military police investigation. The thick black smoke from the burning Renault FT burned the morning air as the first military police trucks rumbled through the barracks gates. The moment the Gendarmerie Nationale arrived, everything changed. The usual order of the training ground, the steady rhythm of drills, the distant chatter of mechanics, the occasional barked command from a sergeant, was replaced by something colder, heavier. The gendarmes stepped out of their vehicles with practiced efficiency, their navy blue uniforms crisp, their boots clicking against the dirt as they moved with a purpose that left no room for argument. Their presence alone was enough to make even the most hardened soldiers tense up. Everyone in the French army knew that when the military police showed up, things were about to get difficult. A sergeant of the gendarmerie, a stocky man with a hard-set jaw and an air of quiet authority, was the first to speak. His voice was calm, but firm enough to carry across the now silent training field. Nobody moves until we say otherwise. The order landed like a stone. Soldiers who had been muttering among themselves fell silent. Even the mechanics, who had been inspecting the other Renaults for signs of failure, slowly stepped back from the tanks, hands raised slightly, as if trying to show they had nothing to hide. The rope perimeter around the wrecked Renault was unrolled with mechanical precision, sectioning off the blast site. Moreau stood a few feet from the wreckage, watching carefully. He had expected the police to come, but not this quickly. A lieutenant from the gendarmerie, taller than the others, his uniform pressed to perfection, approached him directly. The man's gaze flicked over Moreau's uniform, pausing slightly at the captain's insignia before he spoke. Captain Moreau. Moreau met his gaze evenly. That's me. The lieutenant nodded once, pulling out a small leather notebook from his coat pocket. You are the commanding officer of this training exercise? Moreau kept his posture straight. Yes. The lieutenant's eyes didn't waver. Then you'll be staying here. We'll need your full statement before this investigation moves forward. That was expected. Moreau simply nodded. Of course. The lieutenant turned slightly, surveying the field before motioning to his men. Lock it down. No one touches the wreck until the inspectors arrive. The sound of boots scraping against the dirt filled the tense air as more gendarmes spread out, reinforcing the perimeter. The mechanics, normally the first to examine a failed vehicle, were ordered to step away. Even Sergeant Marchand, who had been leading the drill when the explosion happened, was kept at a distance. The injured soldier had already been evacuated by the medics, taken to the infirmary before the police arrived. Moreau had seen him go young, barely more than a recruit, his face pale from shock, his uniform stained with blood. He had been lucky. If he had been any closer to the explosion, they'd be gathering his remains instead of treating his wounds. Moreau exhaled slowly. This was no longer just a training accident. It was now a full military investigation. The next phase began almost immediately. A second truck pulled in through the barracks gates, this one marked with the emblem of the Ministère de la Guerre, the War Ministry. A pair of officers stepped out, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions unreadable. These were investigators from the general staff, men whose entire careers revolved around handling incidents within the French army. Moreau watched as they were greeted by the lieutenant from the gendarmerie, who gave them a short, efficient report of what had happened so far. One of the investigators, a thin man with a neatly trimmed mustache, nodded slowly before turning toward the gathered officers. We will be conducting a formal inquiry into this event, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. Until further notice, all training exercises are suspended. No one is to leave the barracks without authorization. Moreau felt the shift in the air before he even turned to look at the men standing around him. The soldiers weren't just nervous anymore. They were wary. The investigator continued. All officers involved in the drill will be required to give formal statements before the day is out. Any soldier found withholding information will face disciplinary action. Moreau clenched his jaw slightly. They weren't just looking for answers. They were looking for someone to blame. A few feet away, Renault muttered under his breath, just low enough for only Moreau to hear. Well, this is going to be fun. Moreau didn't reply. His mind was already working through the possibilities. If this was being treated as a serious incident, then that meant they weren't ruling out sabotage. That was both good and bad. Good, because it meant Moreau wasn't alone in suspecting foul play. Bad, because if Clement or someone else was involved, they would be working just as fast to control the narrative. The officers from the War Ministry didn't waste time. Within minutes, Moreau and the others involved in the training were escorted to a separate building, away from the enlisted men. One by one, officers were called into a room where a small panel, one investigator, one gendarme, and a secretary taking notes asked them about the morning's events. When Moreau's turn came, he walked into the barely furnished room, the scent of old paper and ink hanging in the air. The investigator, the thin man from earlier, motioned for him to sit. Captain Moreau, he said, folding his hands neatly on the desk. Tell me everything you remember. Moreau took a slow breath. He had seen interrogations like this before, formal, methodical, not outright hostile, but designed to make the officer in question slip up, contradict himself, say something that could be turned against him. So he chose his words carefully. I was overseeing the training exercise, he began, keeping his voice calm, even. The Renaults were running standard maneuver drills. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then the explosion happened. The investigator watched him closely. Did you notice anything unusual before the explosion? Any mechanical failures? Any warning signs? Moreau shook his head. No. The Renault in question had been running without issue. The explosion was sudden. No warning. The investigator tapped his fingers against the desk. Did you personally inspect the wreckage before the military police arrived? Moreau hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Only to ensure the crew was evacuated, he said. I did not interfere with the wreck itself. It was mostly true. He had seen the damn wire, the evidence of sabotage. But if he said anything now without proof, without leverage, it could backfire. The investigator watched him for a moment longer, then nodded. Very well. You'll be required to remain on base while the investigation continues. Moreau stood, saluted, and left the room. Outside, Renault was waiting. He raised an eyebrow. How bad was it? Moreau exhaled through his nose. Bad. But not as bad as it could be. They both glanced back toward the training field, now eerily silent. The Renault's burned-out shell sat under heavy guard, the wreckage untouched, the investigation now fully in motion. Moreau didn't know who had done this, but he knew one thing. Whoever was behind it had just raised the stakes. 18. The investigation begins. The wreckage of the Renault FT sat in eerie silence. The sun was beginning to set, but the investigation was only just beginning. Lieutenant Jean Fournier of the Gendarmerie Nationale stepped carefully over the perimeter rope, his polished boots pressing into the dirt as he surveyed the charred remains. He had seen accidents before, but this didn't feel like one. The two mechanics waiting beside the wreck, Lefebvre and his assistant, Dumas, stood stiffly, their hands still smeared with oil and soot. They had been pulled off their routine duties and given a direct order: examine every inch of the Renault and determine the cause of the explosion. Fournier turned to Lefebvre, who was already running his fingers over the twisted remains of the engine casing, his brow furrowed. Let's get to it, Fournier said, flipping open his notebook. Tell me what you see. Lefebvre grunted, crouching down as he ran a hand along the side of the engine. Something's off. Dumas, younger and more cautious, adjusted his cap before kneeling next to him. It's not a normal engine failure. The casing is too warped, almost like it burst from the inside. Fournier scribbled something down. Could that happen under extreme heat? Lefebvre scoffed. Not like this. These engines run hot, sure, but they don't just. He gestured at the mangled metal. Detonate. Dumas, his voice quieter, added. If this were just heat buildup, the failure would be gradual. The crew would have noticed something wrong before it went off. But they didn't. Fournier glanced up. And what does that mean? Lefebvre exhaled sharply, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. It means someone helped it fail. The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Lefebvre stood and gestured for Fournier to follow him toward the partially collapsed fuel system. The smell of burnt gasoline still lingered, but beneath the soot, something else caught his attention. He pointed at a thin, melted strip of metal near the engine's intake valves. That's where it started, he muttered. See the warping? The fire spread outward, not inward. Fournier narrowed his eyes. So it wasn't an internal failure. No, Lefebvre confirmed. It was tampered with. Dumas, still kneeling, reached into his tool bag and pulled out a small chisel. Carefully, he chipped away at a section of the twisted piping, revealing a thin, copper coil embedded in the damaged metal. Fournier's breath hitched. What the hell is that? Lefebvre's jaw tightened. A detonator wire. Silence. Dumas exhaled, shaking his head. No way this was an accident. Someone wanted this tank to go up in flames. Fournier's grip on his notebook tightened. He had walked into this expecting a simple case of mechanical failure. Now he was standing in the middle of a deliberate act of sabotage. Fournier stepped away from the wreckage and motioned for his two sergeants to approach. Lock down the maintenance records. I want a list of every man who touched this Renault in the last 2 weeks. Mechanics, tank crews, officers, everyone. One of the sergeants, a lean man with sharp eyes, nodded. What about Moreau? Fournier hesitated for a brief second, then shook his head. He wasn't near the tank before the explosion. We'll question him, but we're not jumping to conclusions. The sergeant smirked. Some in Paris might disagree. Fournier ignored the comment. This wasn't about politics, it was about facts. He turned back to Lefebvre. Tell me about the Renault's last maintenance cycle. Who worked on it? Lefebvre frowned, rubbing his chin. Officially? Just my team. But, he hesitated. The barracks have been busy. People move in and out of the maintenance bay all the time. Someone could have tampered with it during a shift change. Fournier sighed, closing his notebook for a moment. This was getting worse by the second. If this is sabotage, he said slowly, then that means we're dealing with someone who has knowledge of armored vehicles. Someone who knew exactly how to rig the engine to explode without drawing attention. Lefebvre nodded. Whoever did this wasn't some half-trained recruit playing a prank. This was a professional job, Dumas added. And sir, this method of sabotage, it's not French. Fournier's gaze snapped toward him. Explain. Dumas hesitated, glancing at Lefebvre for permission before speaking. I saw something like this before, he said carefully. Years ago, during training exercises near the Belgian border. The Belgians had been dealing with sabotage attempts on their tanks. Someone had rigged their fuel lines to explode in a very similar way. They suspected foreign agents, but nothing was ever proven. Fournier's mind raced through the implications. If this wasn't just internal politics, if this was an outside operation, then the army had a much bigger problem than just a rogue saboteur. Fournier strode toward the barracks, the tension in his shoulders tightening as he prepared for the next step in the investigation. Inside, the first round of questioning was already underway. Mechanics, tank crews, and junior officers were being pulled into separate rooms one by one, interrogated under the watchful eyes of the military police. Fournier stepped into one of the rooms, where a young mechanic sat stiffly in a wooden chair, his uniform still stained with oil. Across from him, a gendarme sat with a clipboard, scribbling notes. The mechanic's hands were fidgeting, his expression tense. Fournier sat down across from him, leveling a calm but firm gaze. You're nervous, he observed. The mechanic swallowed hard. I didn't do anything, sir. Good, Fournier said. Then you won't mind answering a few questions. The mechanic nodded quickly. Fournier leaned forward slightly. Do you know who was in the maintenance bay the night before the explosion? The mechanic hesitated. There's always people moving through, but, well, I did see something strange. Fournier's eyes narrowed. Go on. The mechanic licked his lips. There was an officer. I didn't recognize him at first. He wasn't one of the usual ones that checks in on us. But he was standing near the Renaults, like he was watching something. Fournier's pulse quickened. Describe him. The mechanic furrowed his brow, thinking. Tall, dark hair. Looked like an officer, but I couldn't see his insignia. And he left as soon as I walked in, almost like he didn't want to be seen. Fournier leaned back in his chair. And you didn't report this? The mechanic looked down. Didn't think it mattered at the time. Fournier nodded slowly. He knew what was coming next. More questioning, more uncertainty, and more pressure to find answers before this became something bigger. He glanced toward the door, where his sergeant was waiting with a list of officers stationed in Verdun. They had their first lead, and if they didn't handle it carefully, this was about to explode into something far bigger than just one sabotage tank. 19. Caught. The Gendarmerie Nationale had turned every corridor into a checkpoint, every conversation into a calculated exchange. Nobody wanted to be the one to speak out of turn, especially now that Fournier's investigation had a direction. The unknown officer. It wasn't much to go on, but it was the first real lead. Fournier knew that if they didn't move quickly, whoever was behind this would find a way to cover their tracks. The key was identifying the officer before word of the investigation spread too far. Inside the makeshift command post, a former storage room repurposed for the inquiry, Fournier and Sergeant Delacroix sat at a long wooden table littered with open personnel files. A single desk lamp flickered, casting shadows across the reports. A stack of documents, freshly retrieved from the administrative offices, contained the names of every officer who had been stationed at Verdun in the past month. Fournier flipped open one of the files and rubbed his temple. Let's start simple. We know this officer was seen near the Renaults the night before the explosion. That means they had access to the maintenance bay. Cross-check that with the depot logs. Delacroix, already scanning through the night duty records, muttered, Problem is, officer access doesn't always get logged the way it should. They aren't expected to sign in and out like enlisted men. He exhaled sharply. We could be dealing with someone whose presence wasn't recorded at all. Fournier tapped a finger against the table. Then we find someone who remembers seeing him. Perrier gave us a vague description: tall, dark-haired, wearing an officer's coat. That could fit half the men here. Delacroix smirked. Maybe we should start arresting anyone over 6 feet tall. Fournier ignored the sarcasm, flipping to another document. Let's focus on the officers who had direct oversight of the Renaults. Who was assigned to inspect or monitor them in the last 2 weeks. Delacroix scanned the names, frowning. Mostly the usual men, logistics officers, engineers, maintenance liaisons. But there is one name that stands out. Fournier leaned in. Who? Delacroix slid the document across the table. Captain Henri Vaillant. The name didn't ring any immediate alarm bells, but that didn't mean much. Fournier picked up the file and started reading. Transferred from Metz Command, March of this year. Background in supply chain logistics. No direct armored training, but assigned to Verdun's logistical support division. Delacroix raised an eyebrow. Supply and logistics? What the hell would a man like that be doing in the maintenance depot at night? That's the question, isn't it? Fournier muttered. He turned to the next section of the file: previous deployments, assignments, commendations. Nothing unusual. But then, he spotted something that made his pulse quicken. Delacroix, he said quietly. Vaillant spent the last 2 years overseeing shipments from Belgium. Delacroix straightened, immediately following his line of thought. And what did Dumas say? That he saw something like this sabotage before in Belgium. Fournier closed the file with a quiet snap. Find Vaillant. Now, Vaillant wasn't in his assigned quarters, and that was the first red flag. The officers' barracks were quiet this late in the evening, most men either asleep or finishing up their reports for the day. Fournier moved through the narrow hallways with purposeful steps, Delacroix and 2 gendarmes following close behind. When they reached Vaillant's door, Delacroix knocked. Captain Vaillant? Open up. No response. Delacroix glanced at Fournier, who nodded. One of the gendarmes stepped forward and turned the handle unlocked. Another red flag. The door creaked open, revealing an empty room. No personal belongings, no clothing, not even a discarded uniform. The bed was made with military precision, and the only sign that anyone had lived there was the faint scent of tobacco smoke still lingering in the air. Fournier stepped inside, his jaw tightening. He's gone. Delacroix cursed under his breath. We were too slow. Fournier scanned the room. No. If he left in a hurry, he would have left something behind. He gestured to the gendarmes. Search everything. They moved quickly, pulling open drawers, checking beneath the bed, inside the small footlocker at the base of the room. Nothing. Then Delacroix, checking the desk, froze. Wait. Fournier turned. Delacroix had lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a small, folded envelope hidden beneath it. Carefully, Fournier took it, unfolding the paper inside. The message was brief. Too brief. Arrival confirmed. Awaiting next phase. Maintain discretion. No signature. No date. Just a single phrase beneath the message, written in shorthand. Fournier didn't recognize it immediately, but Delacroix did. His face darkened. That's not a French code. Fournier read it again, his pulse quickening. Then whose is it? Delacroix hesitated. I don't know for certain, but it looks a lot like old German cipher markings. Silence filled the small room. The seriousness of that implication settled over them like a heavy fog. If foreign interference was confirmed with proofs, unlike yesterday where they just discussed this possibility, then the explosion wasn't just about internal military politics anymore. This was espionage. But for what? Why in a small barrack of French army for a single tank? Fournier wasted no time. They needed to stop Vaillant before he disappeared completely. They split into teams. Delacroix and 1 gendarme would check the train station, in case Vaillant had taken the most obvious route out of Verdun. Fournier and the remaining officer moved to the motor pool, where military vehicles were stored. If Vaillant had planned this escape in advance, he might have secured transport. The motor pool was dimly lit. Fournier moved between the vehicles carefully, his hand resting near his sidearm. A faint scraping noise echoed from deeper in the garage. Fournier signaled to his partner, motioning for silence as they approached the far end of the building. Near the last row of vehicles, a figure crouched beside a supply truck, fumbling with something near the engine. Hold it, Fournier barked. The man turned sharply, Vaillant. For a split second, their eyes met. Then Vaillant bolted. Fournier drew his revolver, but didn't fire, knowing they needed him alive. He ran after him, boots slamming against the concrete floor. Vaillant sprinted for the service door at the back of the motor pool, his breath ragged. He shoved it open just as Fournier reached him, grabbing the back of his coat and yanking him backward. The force sent both men crashing to the ground. Vaillant struggled, but Fournier pinned him, wrenching his arm behind his back. You're done, he growled. Delacroix and his team arrived moments later, weapons drawn. 20. Who paid you? The room was cold and filled with smoke of cigarettes. A single oil lamp flickered. The military police had repurposed an old storage building for the interrogation, its thick brick walls ensuring that whatever happened inside would not be overheard. Captain Henri Vaillant sat in the center, wrists bound to the chair, his face pale but composed. His uniform was slightly disheveled from the chase, his breath still uneven. Yet, despite his predicament, he was calm. Too calm. Lieutenant Jean Fournier watched him for a long moment before finally speaking. You ran. Vaillant lifted his eyes, expression unreadable. You chased me. Fournier smirked slightly, rolling up his sleeves as he took a seat across from him. Interesting response. A normal officer would have demanded a lawyer, thrown around his rank, pleaded innocence. He leaned forward. But you didn't. You knew the moment we found your little message that this was over. Which means you're either incredibly stupid, he paused, or you knew exactly what you were doing. Vaillant didn't answer. Sergeant Delacroix, standing near the wall, exhaled through his nose. Oh, he knows, all right. He pushed off the wall and approached, his boots echoing in the confined space. And we're going to make sure he understands just how bad his situation is. Fournier leaned back in his chair, sighing. You've got two options, Vaillant. You tell us everything, or we drag this out for days, and trust me, that's not going to be pleasant. Still, no answer. Delacroix circled behind Vaillant, resting a firm hand on his shoulder. You know, he said conversationally, I've always admired men who can hold their nerve. That kind of discipline, it's rare. But do you know what's even rarer? He gripped tighter, making Vaillant flinch. Men who don't break. Vaillant didn't flinch again, but his breathing changed. Slightly shallower now. Fournier watched, reading every movement. He could see it, the flicker of calculation, the subtle tightening of the jaw, the barely noticeable twitch of the fingers. He was holding on, but not forever. All right, Fournier exhaled, standing. Let's make things simple. He moved behind Vaillant, pressing a hand against the back of his chair. We already know about the detonator wire. No reaction. We know about the message hidden under your floorboards. Vaillant's jaw tightened. And we know you had access to the Renault depot before the explosion. Still, nothing. Delacroix sighed dramatically. You really think keeping quiet is going to do you any good? You're already caught. Vaillant. It's over. Vaillant finally spoke, his voice low. Is it? Fournier narrowed his eyes. You tell me. Vaillant inhaled slowly, shifting slightly in his seat. You don't know nearly as much as you think. Fournier let the words sit between them before finally responding. That's the thing, Captain. We don't need to. Because at the end of the day, your silence isn't going to protect you. It's going to bury you. Delacroix cracked his knuckles. And trust me, I'd rather take the long way. A moment of silence. Then, Vaillant did something unexpected. He smiled. Fine, he said simply. Fournier and Delacroix exchanged a glance. Vaillant adjusted his posture slightly, rolling his shoulders as much as his restraints allowed. I'm a professional. I don't belong to any country. I was given a job. I did it. Fournier folded his arms. What job? Vaillant shrugged. Blow up a Renault. Delacroix scoffed. That's it. That's it. Fournier's mind worked quickly, sorting through the implications. You were paid to sabotage a single tank during training? Correct. Delacroix frowned, his frustration showing. That doesn't make sense. Why? Who benefits from that? Vaillant exhaled, tilting his head slightly. Conflict benefits many people. Fournier narrowed his eyes. What kind of conflict? Vaillant finally leaned forward, his voice dropping to a quiet murmur. There's a war happening in this army, Lieutenant. Not with bullets. Not yet. He smirked slightly. But there are sides forming, aren't there? Men who believe in tradition, and men who think change is coming. Some of them are willing to let time decide. Others, he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. They think the only way to win is to start the fire themselves. Delacroix's expression darkened. You're telling me you blew up a tank just to make officers argue with each other? Vaillant's eyes flicked toward him. It worked, didn't it? Fournier's stomach turned slightly. He wasn't wrong. Since the explosion, the debate over armored warfare had intensified. Officers who had once been neutral were now taking positions, some reinforcing their belief in static defense, others questioning whether the traditionalists were dragging the army into obsolescence. The conflict had been minor before, but now? Now, people were taking sides. Delacroix let out a harsh laugh. All this, just to create a little more tension? What kind of bastard pays for that? Vaillant's smirk faded slightly. The kind who think France isn't prepared for the war that's coming. The words hung in the air. Fournier exhaled through his nose. Who hired you? Vaillant shook his head. That, Lieutenant, is something you won't get out of me. Fournier studied him for a long moment before finally stepping back. Doesn't matter. We already have enough to end you. Vaillant tilted his head slightly, as if amused. Then I guess this is where we part ways. Fournier didn't answer. He motioned to the gendarmes. Get him locked down. No outside contact. No communication. The guards hauled Vaillant to his feet, leading him toward the exit. Delacroix waited until he was gone before shaking his head. Son of a bitch really thought he was clever. Fournier rubbed his temple. Because he was. Delacroix let out a tired chuckle. So what now? Fournier exhaled. Now, we let Paris know what we found. The phone line crackled slightly as Fournier sat in the dimly lit office, the Paris Military Bureau on the other end. Lieutenant Fournier, reporting from Verdun, he said, his voice steady. We have the suspect in custody. Name, Captain Henri Vaillant. He confessed to sabotage. A pause, then a voice on the other end. Confirmed motive? Fournier ran a hand over his face. Destabilization. An attempt to fuel internal division between factions within the army. Another pause. Then, acknowledged. Await further orders. The line went dead. Fournier sat in silence for a moment before finally standing. The case was closed, but somehow, it felt like it was only the beginning. 21. Moreau and Fournier. The barracks were eerily quiet at this hour. Most of the officers had turned in for the night. The only sound in the dimly lit storage room was the faint clink of glass against wood as Moreau swirled the last remnants of whiskey in his cup. He had been drinking alone for nearly an hour, lost in thought. The door creaked open. Moreau didn't bother looking up. He already knew who it was by the sound of the boots against the floor. Lieutenant Fournier. Fournier stepped inside without invitation. He didn't say anything at first, just pulled out a chair and sat across from Moreau, placing a fresh bottle of whiskey between them. You drink alone often, Capitaine? Moreau finally looked up, his expression unreadable. That depends. You here to drink, or do you have something to say? Fournier exhaled, rolling up his sleeves. A bit of both. He grabbed the bottle, poured himself a glass, then topped off Moreau's without asking. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. That caught Moreau's attention. He straightened slightly, studying Fournier's face. The lieutenant was serious. Moreau set his glass down, fingers tapping lightly against the wood. Now you've got me curious. Fournier took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle before speaking. Vaillant. Do you know him? Moreau frowned. Henri Vaillant. Logistics officer. Fournier nodded. Not anymore. He's in a cell now. Moreau's brow furrowed. What? Fournier leaned forward, voice low. He was the saboteur. The man responsible for the Renault FT explosion. Moreau froze for a second. The words sank in more deeper than he thought. You're serious. Deadly. Moreau studied him carefully. You shouldn't be telling me this. Fournier smirked slightly. No, I shouldn't. Then why are you? Fournier sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Because I think you need to know. And because I don't like how this whole thing smells. He exhaled. The official report is going to be buried under classified orders and bureaucracy. But here's the truth. Vaillant isn't working for any country. He's a mercenary, a professional saboteur hired to sow division. Moreau's grip on his glass tightened slightly. Division? Fournier nodded. Not to weaken our military strength directly, but to deepen the cracks already forming. The debates over doctrine, armor versus infantry, the growing political tensions in Paris. Someone wanted to pour fuel on all of it. A small fire now, but one that could turn into a blaze later. Moreau leaned back, digesting the information. And you believe him? Fournier let out a short laugh. Believe him? No, but I believe in the evidence. He confessed once he realized he had no way out, and everything he said lines up too well with what we already suspected. This wasn't some petty act of sabotage. It was planned, carefully, and whoever hired him knew exactly what they were doing. Moreau exhaled slowly, his mind working through the implications. And yet, you're telling me this. Fournier's eyes flickered with something unreadable. I think you're one of the few people who actually understands what's happening here. Moreau tilted his head. You think I understand? I'm just a captain, Fournier. A training officer. Fournier scoffed. Don't insult my intelligence. You see things the others don't. He tapped his glass lightly against the table. So tell me, Capitaine, who do you think benefits from an army that's too busy fighting itself to prepare for what's coming? Moreau went still for a moment. Then he took a slow sip of whiskey, set the glass down carefully, and met Fournier's gaze. How much do you know about Hitler? Fournier frowned at the abrupt shift. Enough. He's a nationalist, a populist, a man who loves the sound of his own voice. The papers write about him constantly, but the real politicians don't take him seriously. Moreau exhaled through his nose. They should. Fournier studied him. Why? Moreau ran a hand over the table, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath his fingertips. He had to be careful. Too much truth, and Fournier would think him insane. But if he didn't say enough, the moment would pass, and the warning would be lost. So he chose his words deliberately. Hitler isn't just another demagogue, he said finally. He isn't just another nationalist stirring up the masses. He's something else. He understands how people think, how they move, how they can be controlled. And more than that, he knows how to make people want to be controlled. Fournier's expression didn't change, but Moreau could see the gears turning. You think he's dangerous? Moreau chuckled darkly. I think he's the most dangerous man in Europe. Fournier leaned back slightly, swirling his whiskey. And you think he's behind this? Moreau shook his head. Not directly. Not yet. But tell me, Fournier, if someone wanted to weaken France before a future war, how would they do it? Would they launch an invasion? No. That would rally the nation. Would they attack our industry? No. That would force us to modernize faster. He tapped the table lightly. They would attack our faith in ourselves. They would make us doubt our leadership, our doctrines, our alliances. They would make us hesitate, make us argue, make us weak before the first shot was even fired. Fournier was silent for a long time. Then he exhaled sharply. You make it sound like the war's already started. Moreau met his gaze. It has. Fournier's fingers tightened slightly around his glass. He wasn't convinced. Not fully. But Moreau could see the doubt creeping in, the slow unraveling of certainty. You think Germany's already moving against us? Fournier asked finally. Moreau smirked. I think you'll remember this conversation a few years from now. Fournier exhaled through his nose, finishing his whiskey in one gulp. I hope you're wrong, Moreau. So do I, Moreau murmured. So do I. Silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Fournier stood, adjusting his uniform. I need to report this to Paris. They need to hear our conclusions about Valon. Moreau watched him go. This conversation has changed his perception of the current situation. He thought it was Clement or some random officer who wanted to bring him down, but now it seems that this sabotage was something bigger than that. The current French government and official are not ready for the Third Reich and the horrors it will bring, which is why they are neglecting Hitler as a madman, but soon. This madman will launch a torrent of steel that will conquer the whole Europe. As the door shut behind Fournier, Moreau took another slow sip, staring at the empty chair across from him. He already knew how this story ended. 22. Another conversation. The barracks had returned to a state of uneasy normalcy in the days following Valon's arrest and the abrupt end of the investigation. No more military police patrolling the corridors, no more officers whispering in corners about sabotage. The War Ministry had sealed everything in bureaucratic silence, stamping it as an isolated extremist act and ensuring that the matter would not be discussed beyond classified circles. Moreau expected things to settle after that. But now, for the second time in less than a week, he was being summoned in secret. It was late. The kind of late where even the most disciplined men in the barracks had long since collapsed into their bunks. The corridors were silent, save for the occasional noise of a patrolling sentry's boots. Moreau walked through them with an uneasy familiarity, heading toward the nondescript storage building where his previous secret conversation had taken place. When he entered, he was expecting Fournier or some other officer with unfinished business. Instead, he found a man in civilian clothing. The man stood near the far end of the room, leaning against a wooden crate with a casual ease that felt entirely at odds with his presence. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, his dark hair neatly combed, his features sharp but unreadable. He had the look of someone who could blend into any crowd, the kind of face that one might see a dozen times in a day and never recall afterward. Moreau closed the door behind him, exhaling. I assume you're not here for a drink. The man smiled faintly. No, Capitaine. But I do appreciate a man who values directness. His voice was measured, unhurried. Moreau had met men like this before, not in this life, but in his previous one. Men who didn't wear uniforms, but held power nonetheless. This was intelligence. French intelligence. The man gestured toward a seat opposite him. Please sit. Moreau remained standing. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if that response had told him something. Very well, The man continued, clasping his hands behind his back. I didn't come here to discuss your recent troubles. I imagine you've had enough of those already. Moreau's eyes narrowed slightly. So he knew about the sabotage investigation. But he wasn't here for that. The man finally got to the point. Tell me, Captain, what do you know about Spain? The question was so unexpected that Moreau actually hesitated. Spain, not Germany, not the recent unrest in France. Spain. Moreau kept his face neutral, his mind moving quickly. They were still in 1934. The Spanish Civil War hadn't started yet, but it was come. The political fractures, the military unrest, the power struggles. It was all in motion. The world was still ignorant of what was coming. But Moreau wasn't. He had to be careful. Very careful. The man was testing him. If Moreau spoke too casually, he would seem ignorant. If he spoke too precisely, he would seem suspicious. He exhaled through his nose, carefully choosing his words. Spain is in turmoil, he said evenly. Their republic is barely holding itself together. The government is losing control. There are too many factions, too many competing visions for what the country should be. The military isn't unified, and there's been unrest for years. The officers are divided. Some still loyal to the republic, others waiting for their moment. The intelligence officer studied him. Go on. Moreau took another moment before continuing. Socialists, communists, anarchists, all of them competing for influence against the conservatives, monarchists, and fascists. And beneath all of it, the military is growing restless. The officers in Africa, particularly, aren't happy with the republic's policies. The man didn't react, but Moreau sensed a shift in his posture, just the slightest tension. That was interesting. Moreau pushed just a little further. If something happens in Spain, he said carefully, it won't be spontaneous. It will be planned. And it won't be small. The man smiled slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. That is a rather insightful analysis, Captain. Moreau shrugged. I read the papers. The man chuckled, finally walking toward the table and pouring himself a small measure of whiskey from the bottle Moreau had left there earlier. He didn't drink it, just held it, turning the glass in his fingers. And yet, the man said slowly, most of your fellow officers see Spain as little more than a distant political mess, hardly worth their attention. Moreau tilted his head. Do you? The man finally took a sip. I think, he said, that history is often decided long before the first bullet is fired. Moreau said nothing, because he agreed completely. The man set his glass down and looked directly at Moreau. You will continue reading the papers, Captain, and you will continue paying attention to Spain. But, as for this conversation, he gestured slightly. It didn't happen. Moreau nodded slightly. Of course. The man smiled faintly. We will meet again. And just like that, he turned and left. No name, no rank, no explanation, just an implied understanding. As the door shut behind the man, Moreau finally sat down, exhaling slowly. 2 secret meetings in the span of a few days. One with Fournier, a man of the military, bound by rules, by order, by rank. A man who believed in structure and discipline, but was beginning to see the cracks. And now this was different. This was a man who operated in shadows, who wasn't bound by rank or tradition, who saw things beyond orders and doctrine. And now, they were watching him. Moreau poured himself another drink, staring at the flickering lamp. Spain. He already knew how it would play out. The coup, the uprising, the brutal years of war, Franco's rise. He already knew the mistakes that France would make. The hesitation, the indecision, the failure to recognize what Spain meant for Europe. And if this intelligence officer was already probing military men for insight, then it meant one thing. Some people in France already saw the storm coming. The question was how many of them understood just how bad it was going to be. Moreau took a long sip of whiskey. He knew. And now, someone else suspected he did, too. 23. Elise. The cafe was exactly as he had left it. But Moreau knew better than to think nothing had changed. Because he had changed. And so had the way people looked at him. The last time he was here, Renaud had walked in, tossed a summons onto his table, and announced to the entire cafe that he was being sent to Paris for a disciplinary hearing. Moreau didn't need to be a spy to know that everyone had spent the past few weeks speculating about what had happened to him. He could feel it in the way heads turned as he walked past, the subtle hush of conversations shifting, the lingering stares from some of the more frequent patrons. But he wasn't here for them. He was here for her. Elise Marchand was behind the counter, drying a glass, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't say a word. Then, finally, She set the glass down, untied her apron, and walked straight toward him. "You're back," she said, her voice as sharp as ever. Moreau smirked slightly, pulling out a chair and draping his coat over the back of it. "You almost sound surprised." Elise didn't smile. She didn't even sit. Instead, she crossed her arms and stared him down. "You disappeared," she said flatly. "You got dragged to Paris by the disciplinary committee, and then nothing. You came back, but never really came here. No letters, no messages, not even some half-assed excuse. And now, after weeks, you just stroll back in like it's any other night." Moreau sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You make it sound like I had a choice." Elise's eyes narrowed. "Didn't you?" Moreau leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "Would you believe me if I said I didn't?" Elise scoffed. "No." Moreau chuckled. "Then I guess I'm out of luck." Elise rolled her eyes, but she didn't walk away. Instead, she pulled out the chair opposite him, sat down, and rested her elbow on the table, her chin in her palm. "You have 5 minutes to explain yourself before I decide whether I should throw you out or pour you a drink." Moreau exhaled, shaking his head. "Straight to the point. You're not charming your way out of this one, Captain." Moreau smirked. "Good to know where we stand." She didn't return the smirk. "So." Moreau poured himself a glass of wine, taking a slow sip before speaking. "Paris wasn't as dramatic as it sounded." Elise arched an eyebrow. "A disciplinary committee summons doesn't sound dramatic to you?" "Not when you know the army," Moreau muttered, setting his glass down. Elise tapped her fingers against the table, studying him. "Let me guess. Clement tried to get rid of you, and the army decided you weren't worth the trouble." Moreau exhaled. "Something like that. The War Ministry shut it down before it could go anywhere. Everything was swept under the rug." Elise tilted her head slightly. "And you? Are you just going to accept that?" Moreau smirked slightly. "Do I seem like the type?" She scoffed. "No. That's the problem." There was something in her tone, not quite irritation, not quite amusement. Something closer to concern. Moreau wasn't sure what to do with that. "Did people talk while I was gone?" he asked, changing the subject. Elise smirked. "You want the short version or the entertaining one?" Moreau chuckled. "Whichever one gets me my drink faster." Elise leaned back in her chair. "Some of your fellow officers were certain you'd been sent to a prison somewhere. Others thought you were finally being promoted just to keep you quiet. One man swore you had been recruited into intelligence and were already in Berlin seducing German spies." Moreau raised an eyebrow. "I like that one. Makes me sound much more exciting than reality." Elise chuckled. "And then there were the ones who didn't care where you went, just that you were gone." Moreau smirked. "Let me guess, Clement's people?" Elise shrugged. "Like I said, people talk. Some of them think you're arrogant, that you don't respect the way things are done." Moreau exhaled, swirling his glass. "And what do you think?" Elise studied him carefully, her eyes sharp. "I think you're a man who knows he's right, but hasn't figured out how to prove it yet." Moreau chuckled, shaking his head. "You have said the same thing when we met last time. Aren't you? Maybe it's not me who is repeating it, but it's you who have personified it." He hesitated, started thinking about his previous life and this life. Everything is so confusing, but here he is in 1935 France, trying to charm a girl to get under her skirt. He sometimes wonder, what will he achieve, or will he even achieve anything? Maybe. She studied him for a moment, then finally sighed, reaching for the bottle and pouring herself a drink. "Fine," she muttered, taking a slow sip. "But next time you disappear, you owe me more than one drink." Moreau smirked. "I'll take that as permission to disappear again." Elise rolled her eyes. "You're impossible. You keep talking to me, though." Elise exhaled dramatically. "Unfortunately, yes." Moreau chuckled. By the time the cafe closed for the night, it was silent all around. Elise stepped outside, pulling her scarf around her shoulders. Moreau was leaning against the railing just beyond the entrance, hands in his coat pockets. "You waited," she noted. Moreau smirked. "I told you I wasn't running away." Elise studied him for a moment. "You always say that, but you don't seem like someone who stays in one place for long." Moreau exhaled. "Maybe some places are worth staying in." Elise raised an eyebrow. "And Verdun is one of them." Moreau glanced at her. "Maybe." She smirked. "You should work on being less mysterious, Captain." "I thought that was part of my charm." Elise laughed softly, shaking her head. "So what now?" Moreau exhaled, watching the dimly lit street ahead of them. "I don't know. The War Ministry shut things down, but that doesn't mean it's over. And Clement isn't the type to let go of a grudge." Elise nodded. "No, He isn't. But I guess you have more bigger problems, the Clement. They stood in silence for a moment, the river below them reflecting the faint glow of the street lamps. You think things are going to get worse, Elise said finally. Moreau didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, he said, I know they will. Elise sighed. Then I hope you know what you're doing. Moreau gave a small, tired smile. So do I. They started walking again. 24. A day in Verdun. The Verdun barracks was full of activity, as usual early morning. Moreau was already awake by 05:30 hours, not out of obligation, but by habit. The army had a way of molding men into its schedule, and even without orders pressing down on him, he was conditioned to wake with the sun. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air, stretching slightly as he took in the surroundings. The sky was a pale blue. A few non-commissioned officers were already making their rounds, checking the men and ensuring discipline was upheld. The younger recruits, still adjusting to the regimented life, moved with a sluggishness that betrayed their lack of sleep. Moreau exhaled and shook his head. The army never changed. He turned toward the command office. If today was like any other, it would be filled with paperwork, reports, and an endless chain of administrative tasks. Inside, the office smelled of aged paper, stale tobacco, and the faint scent of old ink. The wooden desks were arranged in neat rows, though most were already occupied by clerks and junior officers hunched over their assignments. At the far end, sitting behind a cluttered desk buried under folders, was Renaud, and from the look on his face, he was already losing his patience. Moreau smirked as he approached. I see you're in hell. Renaud grunted, not looking up. If I die, make sure they write death by paperwork on my grave. Moreau chuckled and pulled out a chair, scanning the pile of reports. It was the usual mess maintenance records, supply requests, training evaluations, and disciplinary notices. Anything interesting? Moreau asked, flipping through a document. Renaud snorted. That depends on what you define as interesting. If you enjoy fuel consumption reports and requisition requests, then today is thrilling. Moreau picked up one of the files. Tank fuel allocations for the next 2 weeks. He scanned the numbers, his expression shifting slightly. This isn't right, he muttered. Renaud sighed, rubbing his face. I thought the same thing. We were supposed to get an additional shipment of diesel last week, but it never arrived. Moreau frowned. Where the hell did it go? Some bureaucrat in logistics probably decided another unit needed it more, Renaud replied. Or they're stockpiling reserves somewhere for emergency use. Moreau exhaled sharply. France's military was already stretched thin, and while its officers planned for static defense, they were ignoring the fact that tanks required fuel, parts, and constant maintenance. Moreau grabbed a pen and scrawled a note. I'll bring it up with Perrin. If we can't even run proper training exercises, this whole operation is pointless. Renaud smirked. The Captain Moreau way break the chain of command until someone gives you what you want. Moreau grinned. It works, doesn't it? Renaud chuckled, shaking his head. Just don't get sent to Paris again. By 0800 hours, the barracks had settled into its usual rhythm. The morning drills had begun, and Moreau and Renaud made their way to the training grounds, where rows of young soldiers were lined up, running through their rifle drills. Sergeants barked orders, correcting posture, adjusting grips, ensuring discipline was maintained. Moreau stood back, watching. Line up, shoulder arms, fire, reload, fire again. His gaze shifted toward the tank crews, who were preparing for a new round of field exercises. The Renault and Somua S-35S stood in their designated areas, mechanics making final checks while commanders reviewed their battle plans. Moreau turned to one of the sergeants overseeing the tank crews. Everything running smoothly? The sergeant, a burly man with a thick mustache, nodded. Mostly, sir. One of the Renault is having transmission issues. Mechanics are looking at it now. Moreau sighed. That was the 3rd time this month. These machines were supposed to be the backbone of France's armored forces, but they were slow, unreliable, and required more maintenance than they should. He turned to Renaud. What's our stock on spare parts? Renaud gave him a dry look. Take a wild guess. Moreau pinched the bridge of his nose. Wonderful. Renaud smirked. At least the S-35S are holding up better. For now, Moreau muttered. He watched as a group of tank crews ran through their entry drills, scrambling into their vehicles in a timed exercise. The hatch slammed shut, the engine rumbled to life, and within seconds, the turret was rotating toward a target. It was efficient, but not fast enough. Moreau checked his pocket watch. They need to be at least 5 seconds faster. The sergeant raised an eyebrow. 5 seconds, sir? Moreau nodded. In a real fight, that's the difference between firing first or getting blown apart. The sergeant grunted but didn't argue. I'll push them harder. Moreau clapped him on the shoulder. Good. Let's get them ready for something bigger. By midday, Moreau was back in his office, buried in reports once again. Renaud was across from him, feet up on the table, flipping through a file. You know, Renaud said, I love the old days when life was simple before all this discipline committee and you asking for tank and submitting report. I don't know what has changed you so much in past few weeks. From the day you woke up and confronted Perrin about all this ideology stuff, life has never been the same. Even though we don't say it, Moreau, we have to accept that we have just pulled ourselves into deeper pit of French shit. Moreau didn't look up. That is why I trust you, Renaud, because you and me, while being pulled into this deeper pit, have realized that French army is so traditional and rigid that even a small whiff of neo-realist thinking triggers a chain reaction beyond our control. I really wonder how others like Gual handle this with more intensity. Moreau paused, thinking deeply because he realized from the moment he took over this body, he has been fighting. Maybe it was his subconscious desire to change France that he has done beyond what a normal captain of French army is supposed to do. But he doesn't regret it. He thought of the newspaper headline from this morning. Germany's stability under Chancellor Hitler, a nation reborn. He thought of the intelligence officer who had come to see him, asking about Spain. The change will come, and it will start with Spanish Civil War. 25. Mission and marching. 3rd Armored Division, Verdun Garrison. French Army Headquarters, Verdun. May 7, 1934. To Captain Étienne Moreau, Commanding Officer, 3rd Armored Division, Reconnaissance Detachment. Subject, Reconnaissance Mission to Bouzenville and surrounding border region. Captain Moreau. As of recent intelligence reports, Regional Command has received multiple accounts of unusual military activity near the Bouzenville sector, along the eastern border. While no confirmed violations have been reported, there have been persistent observations from local gendarmerie and civilian sources regarding suspicious movements near the demarcation line. Given the sensitivity of the situation, it is imperative that we conduct a direct assessment. You are hereby ordered to lead a detached reconnaissance force to Bouzenville and the surrounding border region. Your primary objectives are as follows. Investigate the area for any signs of foreign military presence, activity, or infrastructure development. Gather intelligence from local authorities and civilians regarding recent sightings or disturbances. Confirm the status of any French patrols previously assigned to this sector. Observe and report back to command with findings. Under no circumstances are you to initiate hostilities or engage in any actions that may escalate tensions. However, in the event of a hostile confrontation, you are authorized to take necessary defensive measures to ensure the safety of your unit. Your detachment will consist of 1 company of infantry, 120 men, 2 Renault or 35 light tanks, 1 Panhard 178 armored reconnaissance vehicle, and 3 Citroën Congress P19 half-tracks for transport and logistics. This composition will allow for both tactical mobility and adequate force projection should the need arise. Your findings will be reported directly to me upon your return. In the event of an urgent development, use field communication channels to relay immediate intelligence. Maintain radio discipline and be mindful of operational security. This mission is of high strategic importance, and I trust your judgment in executing it with the professionalism expected of an officer of your standing. Signed, Colonel Pierre Perrin, Commandant, Verdun Garrison, French Army, 3rd Armored Division. The letter sat on Moreau's desk, the ink barely dry. It bore the stamp of Regional Command, the signature of Colonel Perrin. The wording was careful, but the meaning was clear enough. Reports had surfaced about unusual activity near the border around the town of Bouzenville, and someone had to be sent to investigate. Moreau had read it 3 times, hoping the words would shift, soften, change their meaning. They didn't. The orders were simple: observe, confirm, report. No engagement unless fired upon. A standard reconnaissance mission on paper. He let out a slow breath, tossing the letter onto his desk before rising to his feet. Moreau made his way toward the motor pool, his boots crunching against the dirt as he crossed the yard. Renaud was already there, leaning against a stack of crates, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had undoubtedly heard the news before Moreau even had the chance to tell him. Information traveled fast in a place like this. Renault watched as mechanics checked the engines of the Renault R35 tanks, their greasy hands working efficiently over the clanking machinery. Beside them, infantrymen were preparing their gear, rolling up bedrolls, checking their MAS-36 rifles, fastening their ammunition pouches. Moreau came to a stop beside him. Renault didn't look at him, just shook his head slightly and let out a low whistle. "You're telling me," he said, voice thick with irritation, "that we're about to drive straight to the border, poke around, and then what? Wave at the Germans and go home." Moreau smirked, glancing at the nearest Renault R35 as one of the mechanics climbed up to check the turret mechanism. "That's the idea," he said. Renault scoffed. "I hate this already." "Good," Moreau said, adjusting his gloves. "That means you'll stay sharp." Renault sighed, finally turning to face him. "You realize what this is, don't you?" Moreau tilted his head slightly, waiting. "They're sending us because they don't want to send someone important," Renault muttered. "If we find nothing, they win. If we find something, they'll pretend we didn't. Either way, command gets to say they acted responsibly." Moreau nodded slightly, rubbing his chin as he considered the words. It was true, of course. The army, especially at this stage, was still trying to convince itself that Germany was bound by treaties, that Hitler was posturing rather than preparing. And yet, intelligence reports were trickling in, vague but persistent. Unusual troop movements, increased activity at the border, unexplained disappearances. It was only a matter of time before those whispers turned into something undeniable. But at least it won't be until 1936, which is next year. Renault studied his expression. "And if we get shot at?" Moreau exhaled slowly. "Then we're just very unlucky." Renault smirked. "Unlucky seems to follow us." Moreau shook his head, turning his attention back to the preparations. The detachment was small but well-equipped for a mission of this nature. A company-sized force, roughly 120 men, a mix of riflemen, machine gunners, and a mortar team for support. They had 2 Renault R35 light tanks, slow and underpowered compared to the German panzers, but armored enough to withstand light fire. 3 Citroën Congress P19 half-tracks provided transport and reconnaissance, and a single Panhard 178 armored car was assigned to lead the scouting efforts. The men moved with the kind of efficiency that came from routine, checking and rechecking their equipment, loading spare ammunition, filling fuel canisters, securing provisions. The half-tracks were stacked with rations, water, and additional fuel for the journey, along with spare parts in case of mechanical failures. The Renaults stood ready, their dull green paint blending into the environment, their 37mm guns sitting idle but prepared. Perrin had chosen Moreau for this mission, and that alone was significant. There were safer choices, men who would conduct the mission mechanically, report back that all was well, and move on. Moreau wasn't one of those men. He would look too closely, ask too many questions, and if something was wrong, he would say so. That was what made him useful. That was also what made him a liability to certain people in high command. The afternoon wore on as the final checks were completed. Moreau stood by the lead half-track, watching the last of the supplies being secured when one of the junior officers approached. "Captain, everything is ready. We can move within the hour." Moreau nodded, glancing at Renault. "No turning back now." Renault sighed dramatically. "I was really hoping for an uneventful week." Moreau smirked, climbing into the lead vehicle. "You signed up for the wrong army." The convoy moved out before sunset, kicking up dust as it left the barracks behind. The road to Bouzenville stretched ahead, winding through rolling hills and open fields, the trees lining the path swaying gently in the evening breeze. The journey would take several hours, and along the way, Moreau settled into the rhythm of military travel. The half-tracks rumbled along, their engines humming steadily. Inside, men sat quietly, some chatting in low voices, others simply staring at the passing countryside. The armored car led the way, its turret manned, eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. The Renault tanks brought up the rear, their heavy treads leaving deep impressions in the dirt road. Renault sat beside Moreau in the lead half-track, stretching his legs out slightly as he adjusted his helmet. "You ever think about how ridiculous this is?" he muttered. Moreau raised an eyebrow. "What part?" Renault gestured vaguely. "We're driving out to the border because someone saw something, but no one actually wants to acknowledge what we might find." Moreau leaned back slightly. "You sound like you're questioning your faith in the Republic." Renault snorted. "I have plenty of faith in France. I just don't have faith in the men running it." Moreau smirked. That makes two of us. The sun dipped lower, and the road grew narrower as they neared their destination, the fields giving way to denser woodland. The border was still some distance away, but the tension among the men was already noticeable. Moreau could feel it too. Even if he knows the future, it doesn't mean everything will be same as in his previous life. God knows if somehow they really found some German troops. 26. Missing. The convoy rumbled down the winding roads. The closer they got to Bouzonville, the quieter the men became. It wasn't fear, at least, not in the traditional sense, but a heightened sense of uncertainty. Moreau could feel it in the way they gripped their rifles tighter, in the way conversations grew shorter, and in how even Renaud, usually the first to crack a joke, sat silently beside him in the lead half-track. The small town of Bouzonville finally came into view as the convoy rounded a bend in the road. Moreau caught sight of the old church steeple rising above the rooftops, its cross silhouetted against the evening sky. Beyond the town, the border loomed just a few kilometers away, a line of dense forests and open fields stretching toward the horizon. From this distance, it was impossible to see anything unusual. The border looked as quiet as ever. The vehicle slowed as they approached the garrison checkpoint, a small military outpost built from sandbag fortifications and wooden barracks. French soldiers were stationed along the perimeter, some leaning against their MAS-36 rifles, others engaged in conversation. A guardhouse stood beside the road, its sentry stepping forward with a raised hand to signal for the convoy to halt. Moreau stood up from his seat, adjusting his cap as he motioned for the column to stop. He hopped out of the half-track, his boots landing on the dry earth with a dull thud. Renaud followed, stretching his arms before exhaling loudly. "Well, here we are," Renaud muttered. "The edge of civilization." "Not quite," Moreau said, "but close enough." The guard, a young corporal, snapped to attention as they approached. His uniform was neatly pressed, but there was fatigue in his eyes, the kind that came from long, uneventful nights spent watching an enemy that wasn't supposed to be there. Captain Moreau, 3rd Armored Division. Moreau introduced himself, presenting his orders. "We're here to conduct reconnaissance of the sector." "Who's in charge?" The corporal hesitated for a second before stepping aside. "Lieutenant Berger is commanding the garrison, sir." "He's inside." Moreau nodded. "Very well. Carry on." As the convoy rolled into the outpost, Moreau took a quick survey of the surroundings. The soldiers stationed here were few, barely a reinforced platoon, and they moved with the casual weariness of men who hadn't seen action in a long time, but were constantly on edge. A handful of Citroën Congress half-tracks were parked beside a supply shed, along with a couple of Hispano-Suiza trucks likely used for logistical support. No heavy armor, no artillery. This wasn't a position meant to hold against a serious attack. They were here to watch. That was all. Moreau turned to Renaud. "Get the men unloaded. I want a full status check on our tanks, half-tracks, and radio communications within the hour." Renaud nodded, already barking orders to the men as Moreau stepped inside the small wooden command building, where a handful of officers were gathered around a large table, maps spread out before them. Lieutenant Berger looked up from his notes, a tired but sharp-eyed man in his early 40s, dressed in a slightly wrinkled uniform. He rose to his feet as Moreau approached, extending a hand. "Captain Moreau," Berger said. "They told me Verdun was sending someone, but I wasn't expecting armor." Moreau shook his hand firmly. "Consider it an insurance policy." Berger smirked, gesturing to the map on the table. "You're here about the reports, then." Moreau pulled up a chair, glancing over the detailed sector map. "I assume you've had eyes on the area?" Berger nodded, tapping a pencil against a marked grid location along the border. "We've received multiple civilian reports of unusual activity near this section. A few nights ago, a group of farmers claimed they saw vehicles moving in the woods across the river, well within the demilitarized zone. No one got a clear look, but it wasn't French. Our own patrols have reported seeing strange lights in the distance, hearing engine noises where there shouldn't be any. No signs of encampments, but we suspect something's moving at night." Moreau frowned. "And what has command said?" Berger sighed. "Nothing useful. They told us to keep monitoring, but not to provoke anything. We've had no direct confrontations, but I have men who swear they're being watched when they patrol." Moreau exchanged a glance with Renaud, who had just entered the room, arms crossed. "You think it's just a psychological trick?" Renaud asked. Berger shook his head. "I wish I could say yes, but something doesn't feel right. And 2 days ago, We sent out a small patrol, 3 men, standard route. They never came back. Silence settled over the room. Moreau's fingers drummed against the table as he considered the implications. No distress calls, he asked. Berger shook his head. No gunfire either. They just vanished. Moreau exhaled slowly, his mind already running through possibilities. Lost. Unlikely. Desertion? Impossible. Ambushed. Most likely. We're heading out tomorrow morning to sweep the area, Moreau said. We'll need full cooperation from your men. Berger nodded. Of course. We'll provide guides familiar with the terrain. But be careful. If something is out there, it's already watching us. Moreau stood, rolling his shoulders slightly. Then we'll make sure to watch back. As they stepped outside, the temperature had dropped slightly. The men were already setting up for the night, some stacking supplies, others checking their rifles under the glow of lanterns. Mechanics were running final diagnostics on the Renaults, ensuring they were fueled and ready for movement. Renault lit a cigarette, watching the scene with an air of forced nonchalance. So, we're just going to walk into the dark tomorrow and hope we don't get shot? Moreau smirked. That's the plan. Renault exhaled a long trail of smoke. Perfect. Moreau walked toward his command tent, pulling out a fresh map and marking potential search routes. He knew the routine: send out patrols, establish contact with locals, rule out obvious explanations. But something about this mission felt different. The missing patrol wasn't an accident. The sightings weren't just paranoia. Something was happening in the Rhineland before it should actually happen, and they were about to find out exactly what, whether Paris wanted them to or not. 27. Morning patrolling. The damp morning air clung to Moreau's skin as he tightened the strap on his field cap. The garrison had been awake long before dawn, soldiers moving between supply depots, refueling vehicles, and checking their weapons. He stood near the lead Citroën Congress half-track, watching as the final preparations were made. Renault leaned against the side of the half-track, arms crossed, watching the infantrymen finish their equipment checks. He took a long, slow breath before muttering, "I hate morning patrols." Moreau smirked slightly, rolling his shoulders as he checked the strap of his revolver holster. "You hate all patrols." Renault gave a half-hearted shrug. "True, but I hate border patrols even more. They always start the same way: boredom, silence, the occasional dead rabbit in the road. But they never end the same way." Moreau didn't disagree. They were preparing for a routine reconnaissance mission, yet there was nothing routine about the situation. The missing patrol had left too many unanswered questions, and the unusual reports of activity near the border had everyone on edge. Lieutenant Berger approached, straightening the leather strap on his map case as he came to stand beside them. "My men are ready. We'll take the western route along the farmland and ridge lines. Your group will move east through the woodland route." Moreau nodded. "If we find anything, we'll signal. No unnecessary risks. Keep formations tight." Berger's face remained unreadable, though his fingers twitched slightly over the map case. "I hope this is just a long walk in the mud, Captain." Moreau exhaled, glancing at the dark tree line in the distance. "So do I." Behind them, the convoy was lined up and ready. The Renault R-35 tank stood idle, its engine humming low, exhaust curling in the morning chill. The infantry squads were finalizing their gear, adjusting rifle straps, securing ammunition pouches, and checking their FM 24-29 light machine guns. "All right," Moreau called out, raising his voice just enough to carry across the group. "Standard reconnaissance formation. Lead squad, 15 meters ahead. Half-track stay at the rear. Renault keeps distance but stays in visual contact. No one separates." The soldiers gave short nods, falling into position with trained efficiency. Renault stepped beside him, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. "Shall we?" Moreau sighed, stepping forward. "Let's move." The convoy moved slowly along the damp dirt road, cutting through rolling fields. The morning was quiet, too quiet. Moreau glanced toward a nearby farmhouse, its chimney sending up a thin wisp of smoke. A middle-aged farmer stood near the fence, arms crossed, his gaze locked on the convoy as they passed. Renault, walking beside the half-track, turned his head slightly. "They're watching us like we're ghosts. They've lived near the border long enough to know when something isn't right," Moreau muttered. As they continued, they passed a cluster of children standing near a well, their wide eyes following the soldiers as they marched past. A little girl, no older than 7, whispered something to an older boy beside her. Moreau caught only 2 words. "Les disparus." The missing ones. Renault glanced at him. They know. Of course they do, Moreau muttered. News moves faster in small towns than in Paris. The dirt road narrowed as they approached the last checkpoint before the border, a small outpost with sandbag defenses and a raised wooden watchtower. A gendarme stood at the entrance, rifle slung over his shoulder, his uniform slightly disheveled. Moreau signaled for the convoy to slow. He stepped forward, taking a measured look at the soldiers stationed at the outpost. They weren't many. 12 men, a single half-track, and an old Hotchkiss M1914 machine gun mounted at the tower. These men weren't expecting a fight. The gendarme captain, an older man with a thick mustache, stepped forward, gripping a worn leather notebook. "You're the men from Verdun?" Moreau nodded. "Captain Moreau, 3rd Armored Division. We're here to investigate the missing patrol." The older officer exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Murd. I told command this was serious, but they didn't want to listen." Moreau raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The gendarme exchanged a glance with one of his men, then took a step closer. The patrol wasn't just scouting the usual paths. They were investigating something. Moreau's jaw tightened. "And what was that?" The officer hesitated before looking toward the tree line. There were tracks in the woods, beyond the old outpost heavy ones. Tire marks. Not French. Too wide for farm equipment, and they didn't match anything we use. Moreau felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. "And you didn't report this?" The older officer laughed bitterly. "Of course I did. Command said it was paranoia. They said the Germans wouldn't be stupid enough to risk an incident here. Not yet." Moreau exhaled sharply. It was exactly what he expected to hear. Paris didn't want a war, which meant Paris didn't want evidence that one had already started. Behind him, Renault shifted uneasily. So the missing patrol wasn't just unlucky. They found something they weren't supposed to. Moreau nodded slowly, scanning the edge of the dense woodland. And whatever it was, someone made sure they wouldn't talk about it. The radio operator approached, adjusting his headset. "Captain, we've confirmed signal strength with the garrison. We'll check in every 30 minutes. Moreau nodded. "Good. I want updates on the half hour, no exceptions. If anything happens, we don't wait for orders from above." The patrol squads were already moving into position, spreading out in staggered formation as they prepared for the forest sweep. The Renault R-35 remained at the rear, its turret swiveling slightly as the crew adjusted their sights. Moreau turned to Renault. "We take it slow. Keep track of every movement, every noise. If something feels wrong, it probably is." Renault sighed, shifting his rifle. "Why do I get the feeling this is going to be one of those days?" Moreau smirked. "Because it already is." The patrol stepped forward, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The trees closed in around them, the air turning colder. They were officially in the unknown now, and Moreau knew something was waiting for them in the dark. 28. What the fuck is this? The forest swallowed them as the patrol advanced deeper into the border zone, moving in tight formation, silent and methodical. Moreau marched with a steady, controlled pace. Renault walked just off to Moreau's right, shifting his MAS-36 rifle slightly as he muttered under his breath. "Still don't like this. This is the second time you have mentioned it." Moreau murmured back, keeping his voice low. "This time, I mean it," Renault replied, shifting his grip. "You ever notice how quiet it gets before things go to hell?" Moreau didn't answer immediately. He had noticed. There were no distant sounds of farm animals, no early morning carts rattling on roads beyond the trees. Even the birds had gone silent. That wasn't natural. The patrol followed French army doctrine for reconnaissance in border zones. Their formation was staggered, spread out in layers to reduce vulnerability. At the very front, the two lead scouts moved at least 20 meters ahead, their rifles raised, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. They were the first to spot any disturbances and the first to disappear if something went wrong. Behind them, the main force of infantrymen moved in loose but structured lines, spaced at 5-meter intervals close enough to remain in sight of one another, but far enough apart to avoid a single explosive or burst of gunfire wiping out multiple men at once. The Renault R-35 followed cautiously in the rear, its turret rotating slowly as the commander inside swept the area with binoculars. The radio operator walked just ahead of the tank, staying within transmission range but keeping distance to avoid being compromised if the vehicle was hit. Moreau's voice was low but firm as he gave quiet orders. "Lead scouts, stagger your movement. I want one of you always covering while the other advances." No one moves blindly into an opening. Squad leaders, keep your men in sight, but don't cluster. We keep our formation disciplined. Understood, Captain. One of the sergeants, du Breuil, acknowledged, adjusting his helmet before turning back to check his men. Moreau kept his expression unreadable. 1936 was supposed to be the moment. That was the year Hitler would send his troops into the Rhineland, violating treaties, testing the world's resolve. But right now, in April 1934, they weren't supposed to be doing anything. Renaud gave him a sideways glance. A big question to ask: what the fuck are we about to walk into? Moreau exhaled through his nose, glancing toward the mist-laden path ahead. That's what we're about to find out. The patrol had been moving for an hour when Moreau raised his fist to silent command. The men stopped immediately, lowering themselves slightly, rifles at the ready. Ahead, the trees opened up into a narrow clearing, where an old gravel road cut through the woods, running parallel to the demarcation line. Moreau knelt, brushing his gloved hand over the dirt. The surface was disturbed, not by foot traffic. Tires, heavy ones. Sergeant Bissett, the most experienced scout, stepped up beside him. The older soldier let out a slow exhale, rubbing his thumb along one of the indentations. Mon Capitaine, this is fresh. Moreau's stomach tightened. How fresh? Bissett ran his fingers through the soil, testing the dampness. A day? Maybe less. Renaud crouched beside them, his expression darkening. That's military weight. Moreau didn't answer. He already knew. This wasn't just a random sweep anymore. He gave a quick series of silent hand signals. The patrol immediately shifted formation, spreading out into a wider arc, adjusting their positions to create overlapping fields of fire while keeping movement cautious. The scouts moved ahead at a slower pace, taking cover more frequently, their rifles now raised at all times. Moreau motioned to the radio operator. Signal the outpost. Let them know we've found fresh vehicle tracks leading deeper into the woods. The radio operator adjusted his headset, his voice low as he transmitted the report. The response from the outpost was a momentary silence, then a simple acknowledgement. Moreau turned back to the tracks. Direction? He asked. Bissett pointed deeper into the forest. Moreau nodded. We follow. Renaud sighed, adjusting his rifle. Of course we do. The patrol moved forward cautiously, tracking the tire marks as they wound through the undergrowth. The woods grew thicker, darker, more enclosed. The Renault R35 struggled with the uneven terrain, its engine grumbling as it navigated through thick roots and damp soil. Then, through the mist, they saw it. A wooden outpost, built from sandbags and timber, sat near the road. The French flag still hung limply on the side of the structure, but the door was ajar. Moreau raised his fist again. Stop. Spread out. Stay ready. The men fanned out, forming a loose defensive arc. The tank commander inside the Renault adjusted the turret slightly, ensuring he had line of sight. Moreau and Renault advanced first. The wooden door creaked softly as Moreau pushed it open. Inside, everything was eerily untouched. Weapons still on the racks. Mess tins sat on the table, half-eaten food still inside. A radio station in the corner, logbook open. Moreau walked forward and read the last message written. Unidentified movement along the demarcation. It had never been sent. He turned to Renault. They never even got a chance to call for help. Renault scanned the quiet room, his jaw tightening. No struggle. No bodies. Moreau's gut twisted. If it had been an attack, they would have fought. If it had been an accident, they would have found something. But there was nothing. A shout came from the perimeter. Sir, over here. Moreau was outside in seconds. A scout knelt near the road, holding up a small metal fragment. Moreau took it, turning it over in his fingers. It was curved, thick, unmistakably part of a track link. Renault leaned in, voice low. Tell me that's not what I think it is. Moreau didn't answer immediately. The fragment was fresh. Renault exhaled. Well, he muttered, I think we just found something we weren't supposed to. Moreau stared toward the fog-covered trees. Germany wasn't supposed to be here. Not yet. But something had changed. And for the first time, he didn't know what was coming next. 29. The plot thickens. Moreau held the track link in his gloved fingers, its weight heavier than it should have been. Fresh, not rusted, recently left behind. There was no doubt now German armor had passed through this forest. The question was why, and where had they gone? Sergeant Bissett knelt beside the track marks, running his fingers over the indentations. He frowned. Mon Capitaine, there's more here. He motioned for Moreau to look closer. The impressions in the soil weren't just from one vehicle. Moreau followed Bissett's hand as he pointed further along the dirt path, where the tracks became more chaotic. See that? Bissett continued. Multiple vehicles. Not just one or two, at least half a dozen, maybe more. And there's something else. He paused, squinting at the ground before brushing away a layer of damp leaves. Beneath them, faint but unmistakable, were boot prints. Moreau's pulse quickened. Infantry. That changed everything. Tanks on reconnaissance missions didn't operate without support. This wasn't just a scouting maneuver, this was something bigger. He straightened and turned to Renault. Get the men into formation. We're moving forward, slow and staggered. No one separates. No unnecessary noise. Renault gave a short nod and turned to the squads. You heard the Capitaine. Spread out. Keep your heads on a swivel. If you see movement, you signal first, you fire second. The men responded immediately, shifting their positions. The scouts moved ahead again, this time even more cautiously, their rifles raised at all times. The infantry spread into a loose but disciplined formation, ensuring they weren't clustered too tightly in case of an ambush. The Renault R-35 tank followed at a slow, calculated pace, the gunner inside, keeping a steady watch through his scope. Moreau checked his watch. They had been in the forest for over an hour now. The deeper they went, the stronger the unease grew. He glanced at the trees ahead. There was no visible sign of enemy movement, but his instinct screamed that they were being watched. Then came the first real break in the silence. One of the scouts, a young private named Marchand, raised his hand and crouched near the base of an old, gnarled tree. Sir, over here, he whispered. Moreau moved quickly, Renault just behind him. When he reached the spot, his stomach turned. Marchand was pointing at a rifle. A Moss 36. French. It was lying half buried in the mud, its strap twisted and snapped as if it had been ripped from the owner's shoulder. Nearby, an overturned helmet sat on its side, dented along the rim. Moreau picked up the rifle, turning it over. The chamber was empty. The safety was off. The last person to hold this had been ready to fire. Missing patrol, Renault muttered. Moreau nodded. One of them, at least. Bissett knelt beside the scene, his experienced eyes scanning the details. He gestured toward the disturbed soil leading toward the trees. Something happened here. See the way the dirt scattered? Someone was dragged. Moreau followed the direction Bissett pointed. The tracks led deeper into the woods, away from the path. Not running. Dragged. Marchand swallowed. Sir, do we follow it? Moreau thought for a moment before shaking his head. Not yet. We follow the tire tracks first. Whatever happened here, it's already done. If we find the missing men, we find them together. We're not splitting up. There were no objections. Every man there knew the risk of chasing ghosts in the woods. If something had happened to the patrol, it had happened fast, and there was no guarantee that whoever had done it wasn't still nearby. They continued forward, following the tank tracks and boot prints, their pace slower, more measured. The forest thickened around them, the underbrush growing denser. The further they went, the more unnatural the silence became. Renault walked just ahead of Moreau, keeping his rifle raised. Something's off, he muttered. Tracks this deep should lead to a camp, a depot, something. But there's nothing ahead but more fucking trees. Unless they left in a hurry, Moreau said. Or wanted to make sure they couldn't be followed. Renault frowned. You think they knew we'd come looking? Moreau exhaled slowly. They would if they expected someone to notice the missing patrol. The thought settled over them like a weight. Had this been planned? Had the missing men been taken as a distraction? If so, then what was the real objective? One of the scouts up ahead suddenly whistled a short, sharp signal. Moreau immediately raised his fist. The patrol stopped in place, rifles raised, eyes scanning. Marchand, what do you see? Moreau whispered. The young scout hesitated for a second before pointing toward a clearing just beyond the trees. Sir, there's a truck. Moreau's pulse quickened. He motioned for Bissett and two others to flank wide before he and Renault crept forward. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Moreau saw it. A French military truck. Abandoned. The canvas cover at the back was torn, and the doors were open. Moreau moved in, raising his revolver slightly as he stepped toward the driver's side. The seat was empty. Blood on the steering wheel. Dried. At least a day old. Renault peered into the back, his expression unreadable. It was transporting crates, but they're gone. Moreau scanned the clearing. There were no bodies. No bullet casings. Just the truck, sitting there, like someone had placed it as a warning. Bissett knelt beside the tire tracks. Sir, the prints don't stop here. Whoever was driving this, they were forced out. Moreau ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just a missing patrol. Something had been taken from this truck, and the patrol had either seen it or gotten in the way. And whatever it was important enough for someone to make sure they disappeared. He turned back to his men, speaking low but firm. We're setting up a defensive position here for now. We report this to command. Then we decide how to proceed. Renaud looked at him. And if command tells us to pull back? Moreau clenched his jaw. Then we know we're onto something. 30 imbeciles. The radio operator sat crouched by the side of the abandoned truck, adjusting the dials on his portable set with quick, practiced hands. The antenna jutted up from the ground, catching the low murmur of static as he tried to tune into the command frequency. Moreau stood nearby, arms crossed, his face unreadable as he watched the operator work. The entire patrol had spread out into defensive positions around the clearing, eyes constantly scanning the thick tree line. They were deep in the woods now, far enough that if something went wrong, help would not arrive in time. Transmission established, Captain. The radio operator finally said, pressing the headset against his ear. Channel secured. Moreau took the handset from him, keeping his voice level. Verdun command. This is Captain Moreau, reconnaissance detachment assigned to Bougainville Border Patrol. Do you read me? A pause, then a crackle of static. This is Verdun command. Reading you, Captain. Moreau exhaled slightly. We've identified multiple signs of foreign military presence in our patrol sector. Vehicle tracks, probable armored movements, and evidence of missing personnel at the last checkpoint. Additionally, we have located an abandoned French military transport with signs of a possible skirmish. Blood on site. No bodies recovered. Silence. The radio remained open. Moreau exchanged a glance with Renaud, who stood nearby, arms resting on his rifle. Something was wrong. After nearly 30 minutes of waiting, of repeating their findings, of hearing vague reassurances from the other end, the radio finally crackled back to life. Captain Moreau, orders from High Command. You are to return to Bougainville Outpost immediately. Do not engage. Do not investigate further. Abort patrol and report back. Moreau blinked. He wasn't sure he'd heard that correctly. Verdun Command, confirm last transmission, he said slowly. You are ordering us to abandon an active investigation into missing French personnel and evidence of enemy presence? A shorter pause this time. Confirmed, Captain. Return immediately. The line went dead. The patrol stood in stunned silence, the only sound being the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. The men turned to look at Moreau, confusion and disbelief etched into their faces. "Ils sont faux," one of the younger soldiers finally muttered. "We have missing men, blood on the ground, and they're telling us to just walk away." "Murd," another soldier spat, kicking a rock into the underbrush. "They want us to pretend we didn't see anything." The murmuring grew louder, frustration simmering into anger. A sergeant cursed under his breath. Another soldier, one of the more hot-headed ones, slammed a fist into the side of the truck. "Do those bastards in Paris think we're idiots?" he growled. "This is treason. We have to keep searching." Before Moreau could react, Renaud was already moving. He grabbed the soldier by the collar and slammed him back against the truck with a bone-jarring force. "You mind your tongue," Renaud growled, his face inches from the younger man's. The usual smirk was gone. His expression was cold, dangerous. "You're a soldier, not some cafe revolutionary. You don't question orders." His grip tightened. "And you don't speak of treason. Not here. Not in front of these men. Not unless you want to end up court-martialed or worse." The younger soldier swallowed, his initial rage giving way to the sudden realization that Renaud wasn't playing around. He nodded stiffly, and Renaud let go, stepping back. Renaud turned to the rest of the patrol, his voice sharp and commanding. "You all have something to say? You want to defy orders? Fine. But I promise you this, if anyone disobeys the chain of command, I'll shoot you myself before command has the chance to." He scanned their faces, letting the words sink in. "Am I clear?" The patrol remained silent. The men weren't happy, but they understood. Moreau watched the exchange unfold, keeping his face impassive. He knew Renaud was doing what needed to be done. Letting soldiers vent was one thing. Letting them start talking about ignoring orders? That was how men disappeared. After a long pause, Renaud turned back to Moreau, his expression unreadable. Moreau gave a small nod. "Good work." Renaud huffed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Someone had to do it. You know how this works. If this talk spreads, command will make sure it's the men, not themselves, who pay the price." "They're already paying the price," Moreau muttered. Renaud smirked bitterly. "Yeah, but they're still alive. Moreau exhaled, rubbing his temple. He turned away from the patrol for a moment, stepping slightly deeper into the woods where no one else could hear them. Renault followed without a word, walking beside him as they stared at the quiet tree line. ILS newsprint port of imbeciles, Renault muttered under his breath. Because they think we are, Moreau replied. His jaw tightened. But they're not even trying to hide it. That's what worries me. Renault nodded slowly, his eyes flicking back toward the abandoned truck. This is political, not military. They'd rather pretend this didn't happen than deal with it, Moreau said, voice low and bitter. Someone doesn't want this getting out. Someone in high command already knows what's going on here. Renault shook his head. And they don't want us involved. Silence hung between them. For a moment, neither man spoke. Moreau could hear the distant chatter of the men behind them, still muttering amongst themselves, still frustrated. He took a slow breath, knowing they had no choice but to obey. They had found something they shouldn't have, and now they were being pulled out before they could learn more. Let's move, Moreau finally said, straightening his shoulders. Renault sighed, giving the truck one last look before spitting into the dirt. Fucking bureaucrats. Moreau turned back to the patrol, his voice steady. Pack up. We're heading back. The men didn't move immediately. Their faces said everything: the frustration, the distrust, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. But no one spoke out this time. They were soldiers. They followed orders. The formation reassembled. The Renault R-35 tank turned slowly, reversing course. The half-tracks kicked up dirt as they began their slow retreat. Moreau took one last look at the clearing, at the trees, at the bloodstains on the truck that would never have answers. Then he turned away. Renault walked beside him as they moved, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not going to let this go, are you? Moreau gave a small smirk. No. 31. What in the actual fuck is going on? The patrol walked through the damp underbrush. The mood among the men was subdued, not just from exhaustion but from the knowledge that they have betrayed the trust of those Soilder who might have been captured by Germans for defending their own land. Moreau led them with a steady pace, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. Renault strode beside him, arms crossed over his rifle strap, his expression tight with barely restrained frustration. Then came the voice. Captain, a message is coming in. The sudden voice made them both turn sharply. The radio operator had stopped a few paces behind them, crouched over his equipment. His headset was pressed tight against his ear, and his fingers were already moving, rapidly scribbling onto a notepad. The crackling of transmission static filled the air around him. Moreau and Renault exchanged a glance before moving back toward him. The rest of the men instinctively halted, murmurs of curiosity rippling through the patrol. Moreau crouched beside the radio operator, watching as he continued transcribing. What is it? The operator's eyes flicked up, his face tense. Sir, it's not from Verdun Command. Moreau's stomach tightened. That was unusual. Very unusual. He watched as the operator's pencil moved in short, precise strokes, his hands steady despite the tension in his face. It was a telegraph-coded, encrypted, something not meant to go through standard radio channels. Who's it from? Renault asked, his brows furrowing. The operator's hand hesitated for a split second before he swallowed and looked up. Colonel Pierre Perrin, sir. Moreau felt his breath still in his chest for just a moment. Renault let out a sharp exhale, his fingers tightening over the strap of his rifle. You're joking, Renault muttered, shaking his head. No joke, sir, the operator said. It's coming through now. His voice dropped slightly. The pressure he was receiving doubled in an instant. And sir, it's direct. A secured channel. Moreau's eyes narrowed. That was not normal. High-ranking officers didn't just bypass standard procedure unless the situation demanded absolute discretion. The transmission continued, the radio clicking in sharp bursts. The operator's pencil scratched against the notepad, breaking the silence between them. Finally, after a long pause, he straightened, exhaling. Sir, message is complete. I'll read it now. Moreau nodded, and the patrol gathered slightly closer, tension rising with every second. The operator cleared his throat and began reading. Urgent, to Captain Étienne Moreau, 3rd Armored Detachment. Disregard order from Verdun High Command. Directive altered through unauthorized channels. Order from command compromised. Proceed with investigation. Confirm foreign military presence. Recover all evidence of French asset losses. Priority, intelligence retrieval. Full report to be transmitted through encrypted frequency 8. Do not use standard military communications. Authorization code 13. Pierre 22. Verdun. Ensure operation remains confidential. Trust no unverified channels. Perrin. Silence. Moreau's fingers tightened into a fist. That authorization code. It wasn't just an ordinary signal. It was Perrin's personal encryption key, a code that was only used for directives that bypassed standard hierarchy, ones that came directly from Perrin himself without oversight. Moreau had only seen it once before, back when Perrin had been handling classified intelligence from Paris. And now he was sending it directly to Moreau, bypassing the entire chain of command. Renault let out a short, humorless laugh. Murd. The patrol remained deathly still, waiting for their officers to react, waiting for some kind of explanation for the madness that had just unfolded. Moreau took a slow breath, his jaw tightening. The entire situation had just changed. 30 minutes ago, High Command had ordered them to turn back. Now, Perrin was telling them that order was compromised. Someone in High Command had interfered with their mission. Someone in their own ranks wanted this buried. Renault rubbed his face with both hands before exhaling sharply. All right, let's just lay this out. High Command tells us to turn back. We all think that's suspicious. And now Perrin tells us to ignore it and keep going because someone in command is covering something up. He threw up his hands. What in the actual fuck is going on? Moreau was silent for a long moment before he turned back to the operator. Nothing else. That was all. The operator nodded. Yes, sir. Message was cut after transmission. No follow-up. No secondary instructions. Moreau turned away, rubbing his fingers against his temple. He could feel the pressure of making the decision pressing down on him. The risk of what this meant. They had two options. One which is follow High Command's orders. Return to Buzenville. Act as though nothing had happened. That would keep them safe, but it would mean turning a blind eye to clear evidence of German activity and missing French soldiers. It would also mean someone in their own hierarchy had just successfully buried the truth. Two, which is follow Perrin's orders. Investigate further, which meant disobeying High Command and knowingly stepping into dangerous territory. If they were wrong, if this backfired, Moreau and his men would take the fall. Renault turned toward him, his voice lower now. You trust Perrin? Moreau didn't hesitate. Yes. Renault let out a slow exhale, his fingers tapping idly against the stock of his rifle. Then I guess we already know what we're doing. Moreau took a deep breath before turning back toward the patrol. The men were watching, waiting for his decision. He let his gaze sweep over them. They were already questioning their orders, already suspicious. If he told them to turn back, they wouldn't fight it, but they'd know something was wrong. He straightened his shoulders, his voice steady. You all heard the message. Colonel Perrin has given us direct orders to continue our investigation. That means this isn't just some missing patrol. We are being deliberately misled. We keep discipline. We move with caution. We follow the evidence. If anyone has doubts, say it now. No one spoke. The message had said it all. Moreau turned back to Renault. Let's move. The patrol turned again. 32. What second sight? What shipment? The patrol moved, and this time there was no hesitation anymore. No second guessing. Colonel Perrin's direct order had sealed that. They weren't just on patrol anymore, they were investigating something that someone in High Command wanted buried. As they approached the abandoned truck, the tension in the air thickened. This time, they weren't just glancing over the scene. They were going to tear it apart, piece by piece, until they knew exactly what had happened here. Moreau gestured for the men to spread out. Bissett, take 2 men. You're on the truck. Check every inch of it. If there's a loose bolt, I want to know about it. Bissett nodded, motioning for 2 privates to follow. They climbed onto the back of the truck with the efficiency of men who had done this before, their hands moving quickly, prying up floorboards, checking the axles, feeling along the seams of the metal for anything hidden. A young soldier voice cut through the quiet. Sir, over here. Moreau and Renault turned as a soldier gestured toward a disturbed patch of dirt near the edge of the clearing. It was small, subtle, not a hole, not a grave, but something deliberately placed. As Moreau knelt, brushing the dirt aside, his fingers closed around a small wooden stick. It had been pressed carefully into the soil, forming a distinct cross. For a moment, there was silence. Moreau turned it over in his fingers, his pulse slowing slightly as his mind began to process. This was deliberate, not random. Someone had placed it here for a reason. Renault crouched beside him, frowning. You think it's a grave marker? Moreau shook his head. No body, no blood, no sign of burial. This isn't a grave. He turned the stick in his fingers. This is a message. Renault exhaled, shifting on his heels. What kind of message? Moreau looked at the shape again. The cross was not religious, not a standard military marking. And then he saw at the angle, the way it leaned slightly to one side. A swastika, or rather, half of one. His stomach turned. Someone had placed this here to be noticed. Whoever put this here wanted us to find it, Moreau muttered. They wanted us to know who was responsible. Renault's jaw tightened. Germans. Moreau didn't answer immediately. It seemed obvious, but something felt too easy about it. Renault leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You're thinking the same thing, aren't you? Moreau exhaled. If it's a message, it's deliberate. If it's deliberate, we have to ask why. He straightened, glancing back at the tracks leading deeper into the forest. No German unit would just leave their mark behind like this. Either they wanted us to follow, or someone wants us to think it was them, Renault finished. A moment of silence hung between them. Before Moreau could respond, Bissett called out from the truck. Sir, we found something. Both Moreau and Renault stood immediately, moving toward the vehicle. Bissett was crouched in the driver's seat, his hand reaching under the dashboard of the truck. Moreau stepped up. What is it? Bissett pulled out a folded sheet of paper, wrapped in canvas cloth. This was wedged under the panel. Whoever put it there didn't want it found easily. Moreau took it, unrolling the cloth and revealing the paper underneath. The ink was smudged, some of the words blurred by dampness, but the language was unmistakably Spanish. Renault peered over his shoulder. His eyes narrowed. That's not German. Moreau didn't answer immediately, scanning the message carefully. The writing was hurried, but clear enough to make out. The shipment is secured. Final orders await at the second site. No mistakes. The moment he finished reading, silence settled over the men gathered around the truck. Bissett exhaled slowly. Spain? What the hell does Spain have to do with this? Moreau rolled the paper in his hands, his mind racing. He had assumed this was about Germany. The tracks, the missing patrol, the deliberately placed symbol, everything pointed to a German operation. But Spain? That changed everything. Renault ran a hand through his hair. What second site? What shipment? He glanced back at the crates that had been emptied from the truck. Whatever was here, it wasn't just routine supplies. If my life was a book, I would have definitely fucked the author for making this patrolling so fucking annoying. Moreau folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. We keep moving. The men readjusted, tightening formation as they pushed deeper into the trees, following the tire tracks and footprints that led away from the clearing. Their advance was slow, deliberate. They were beyond standard patrolling now. They were hunting. The Renault R-35 followed at a crawling pace. The scouts took turns advancing ahead in small bursts, checking every clearing, every small dip in the terrain before signaling the rest of the unit forward. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The deeper they went, the more unnatural the forest became. The trees here were older, thicker, the ground more uneven. Then, finally, they saw it. Through the mist, beyond a small ridge, a camp emerged. Moreau raised his fist. Halt! The men froze immediately, rifles shifting to ready positions. The camp was small, no more than 10 or 12 tents, arranged neatly in a half-circle around a central supply area. Moreau brought up his binoculars. The fire pit in the middle still had faint wisps of smoke curling from the embers. Someone had been here recently, but they weren't here now. Renault adjusted his rifle. I don't like this. Moreau didn't respond. He scanned the edges of the camp, looking for any movement, any sign of life. There was nothing. He lowered the binoculars. We move in. Careful. No mistakes. Bissett and his scouts took the lead, moving forward in staggered formation, rifles raised. They reached the outer perimeter of the camp within a minute, sweeping through the first row of tents. Moreau and Renault followed, stepping into the abandoned site. The closer they got, the stranger it became. Everything was in place. The crates were stacked. The fire had been left smoldering. Even personal belongings were still inside the tents. But no one was here. Moreau stepped into the largest tent. A map was still pinned to a wooden table. He ran a hand over the paper. The markings were faint, hard to make out at a glance, but they were tracking something. Renault moved beside him. They left in a hurry, he muttered, but not in a panic. Moreau nodded slowly. This wasn't a retreat under fire. It was a withdrawal, a planned one. Bissett moved along the perimeter, checking the discarded supplies. No bodies, he called out. No bullet casings. No signs of a fight. Moreau crouched near the fire pit, sifting through the burned remains of paper and cloth. His fingers closed around something metallic, buried in the ash. A small, metal insignia. He pulled it out, turning it over in his fingers. It was German. At least, it was supposed to be. Renault crouched beside him. Looks real. Moreau didn't take his eyes off it. Looks placed. Renault exhaled. So either the Germans were here and wanted us to know it, or someone else was here and wanted us to think the Germans were here. Moreau stared at the silent trees beyond the camp. The answer wasn't here, but it was close. He slipped the insignia into his pocket and stood. Sergeant Bissett, he called out. Get the men ready. We're moving. Renault gave him a sideways glance. You know where to go next? Moreau exhaled, looking at the footprints leading away from the camp, deeper into the woods. Yeah, he muttered. We follow them. 33. Pardon, MES Amos, but what the fuck are you doing here? The patrol moved forward. The dense forest around them, damp with the morning mist, swallowing up their presence as they covered ground. 5 kilometers had passed since they had left the abandoned camp behind. They were deep in unknown territory, following tracks left behind by an enemy they weren't even certain was German anymore. The silence among the men wasn't just discipline, it was tension. They had been prepared to face Germans or possibly even Spanish irregulars. But now, something wasn't right. A sharp whistle cut through the air. 3 bursts, the scout signal. Moreau immediately raised his fist, halting the entire patrol. The men froze instinctively, their weapons shifting slightly as eyes scanned the trees ahead. The Renault R-35's engine noise slowed down as the tank crew cut the throttle, leaving it in a quiet idle. No one moved. Renault exhaled, gripping his rifle tighter. What now? Marchand emerged from the brush, moving quickly but carefully. He was slightly out of breath, his uniform smeared with dirt from crawling through undergrowth. He went straight to Moreau, his face tense. Movement ahead, Capitaine. Moreau's eyes sharpened. Hostile. Marchand hesitated. That's the problem. It's not German. It's French. Silence. Moreau's brows furrowed. Say that again. Marchand licked his lips. I counted at least 20 men. They're wearing French uniforms. Armed. I couldn't see any insignia from my position. A ripple of murmurs ran through the patrol. Some of the younger men exchanged uneasy glances. The enemy they were preparing for wasn't supposed to be French. Renault narrowed his eyes. Are you sure? You didn't misidentify them in the fog. Marchand gave him a sharp look. I know a French uniform when I see one. These men are ours. Moreau clenched his jaw. French troops? Here? It made no sense. No units from the standing border defense had been assigned to this area. It was too deep into the forest, too close to the unknown. Renault let out a sharp breath. Murd. What the hell is a group of French soldiers doing out here? Moreau ignored the question for now. He turned back to Marchand. Did they see you? Marchand shook his head. No, sir. I stayed low. They weren't actively scouting. More like, waiting for something. Moreau's stomach tightened. Waiting for what? Marchand's expression darkened. I don't know. Moreau looked toward the men. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for orders. He took a deep breath. There were only 2 possibilities. 1, this was a friendly patrol that had somehow been assigned here without anyone being informed. That was unlikely, given how rigidly patrol routes were scheduled. 2, they weren't supposed to be here. Moreau turned back to Marchand. You said no insignia? Marchand nodded. Nothing visible. Standard uniforms, but no markings. No regimental badges. Moreau exchanged a look with Renault. That was unusual. French soldiers were always marked with regimental insignia. No insignia meant they were either operating unofficially or hiding their affiliation. Renault ran a hand down his face. All right, let's assume for a second they're not here on friendly terms. How do we handle this? We can't just walk up and ask, pardon, MES Amos, but what the fuck are you doing here? Moreau smirked slightly but didn't respond immediately. His mind was already calculating. They needed to approach carefully. If these men were friendlies, any aggression could turn into a disaster. If they weren't, then things were going to get dangerous very quickly. Moreau exhaled. We need more information before we make a move. Marchand, how close can you get without being seen? Marchand thought for a moment. Within 50 meters, maybe closer if I use the terrain. Do it. Find anything you can names, insignia, what weapons they're carrying. Do not engage. If you're spotted, retreat immediately. Marchand nodded. Understood. Give me 10 minutes. He disappeared back into the trees, moving swiftly and silently. Moreau turned to Renault. We need to be prepared for either outcome. If they're friendly, no problem. If they're not, we need to control the situation. Renault gave him a knowing look. Which means we flank. Moreau nodded. Take half the squad, move around to their right flank. I'll take the other half and move left. The tank stays in the middle as a deterrent. If things go wrong, we contain them from both sides. Renault smirked slightly, adjusting his rifle strap. You're expecting a fight. Moreau's jaw tightened. I'm expecting answers. One way or another. Renault took a deep breath and turned to his men. All right, you heard him. First squad with me, second squad with the Captain. Keep your safeties on, but be ready for anything. We don't fire unless ordered. The men split into two formations, moving quietly into their respective positions. Moreau turned toward Lavelle. The Renault are 35's tank commander. Hold your position here. If things go south, don't fire unless I give the order. Lavelle, a grizzled veteran, gave a firm nod. Understood, Captain. If we do engage. Moreau's voice was calm. Then we end it quickly. The men dispersed into the trees, each group moving into their flanking positions with disciplined precision. Moreau moved carefully with his squad, each step deliberate, his rifle now unslung from his shoulder. The ground beneath them was soft, damp, absorbing the noise. Ahead, beyond the mist, was a group of French soldiers who weren't supposed to be here. Then, suddenly, Marchand reappeared from the trees, moving faster than before. He had been gone barely 8 minutes. Moreau immediately halted. Report. Marchand's face was tense. I got a better look. Their movements, their uniforms, I can recognize their regiment now. Moreau narrowed his eyes. Go on. Marchand took a breath. They're from a regiment based in Paris. Silence. Moreau's stomach dropped. A Parisian regiment? That wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. His mind started working fast. A company stationed in Paris wouldn't have any orders or objective being this far south, deep in border areas. No standard patrol routes. No emergency deployments. Which meant one thing. They were the enemy. 34. Then stop acting like the enemy. The forest became even more suffocating for them to walk. Every step forward felt like stepping into the unknown. The patrol had advanced carefully, methodically, ensuring they had full control before the confrontation even began. The Renault R-35 remained moved slowly as it gave confidence to the troops with its hulking mass of steel and firepower. Its turret had locked onto the direction unknown French regiment. The 37mm cannon was trying to get a better vision to aim directly at their center. Moreau crouched low, signaling Renault, who had positioned his squad to the right. 3 fingers raised. They were ready. From this vantage point, the enemy soldiers were clearly visible. 20 men. They stood in a loose formation, weapons slung lazily over their shoulders, too relaxed for soldiers stationed near the border. Some smoked, others murmured to one another. A few of them stood over a crate, poring over a map spread out across its surface. Moreau frowned. They weren't patrolling. They were waiting. For what? The question has been disturbing him for a while. Marchand, move forward. I need a better look. The scout gave a short nod, then disappeared into the undergrowth. The rest of the patrol waited, tense. Seconds passed. Then, a shout erupted from the enemy ranks. Murd. We're compromised. The moment shattered. Rifles were grabbed. Cigarettes hit the ground. Boots scrambled across dirt. The Paris regiment jumped into a defensive stance, bodies snapping into muscle memory. Moreau immediately raised his fist. Hold your fire. Do not engage unless ordered. The Renault R-35 crept forward, just a fraction, its barrel shifting slightly to make its presence impossible to ignore. From both flanks, Moreau's men closed in, securing a tight perimeter around the enemy unit. Renault's voice was a whip crack through the air. Drop your weapons. You're surrounded. A tense silence followed. The Paris regiment didn't lower their rifles, but they hadn't raised them either. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others shifted, uncertain. Then, one of them, a stocky corporal, let out a scoff. What is this bullshit? You're pointing guns at French soldiers. His voice was laced with disbelief, his hand twitching near the stock of his rifle. Moreau didn't waver. You tell me, Corporal, what's a regiment from Paris doing in a restricted zone near the border without authorization? The corporal hesitated. Behind him, one of his men muttered, we don't have to answer to them. Moreau sighed. Wrong move. He took a step forward, rifle still firm in his grip. You don't have to answer, no? But here's what will happen if you don't. My men will detain you. Your weapons will be confiscated. You'll be marched to headquarters, where I'll be forced to explain why an unidentified unit, deep in a sensitive border region, refused to identify itself. His tone darkened. And trust me, the War Ministry doesn't like mysteries. The corporal swallowed hard. He wasn't a coward, but he wasn't stupid either. One of the younger soldiers in their ranks, barely in his 20s, spoke up suddenly. "We're conducting exercises. Orders from high command." Moreau chuckled, shaking his head. "Exercises? Without notifying the border garrisons? Without insignia? Tell me, do you take me for an idiot, or do you just assume I was born yesterday?" The lieutenant of the Parisian unit, tall, thin, with sharp, cold eyes, finally stepped forward. His expression was unreadable, but Moreau could see the calculations running through his head. "You're making a mistake, Capitaine." Moreau raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" "Because from where I'm standing, you're outgunned, outmaneuvered, and out of time." The lieutenant tilted his head slightly. "And what if we refuse to comply? Are you prepared to kill fellow Frenchmen?" Moreau's eyes didn't waver. "No." He let the word hang in the air before adding, "But I am prepared to have you detained for insubordination and espionage." That's what this is looking like. A group of French soldiers, unmarked, positioned in a strategic location with no clear orders? That doesn't just get brushed aside. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. Renaud, standing just a few steps behind Moreau, let out an exasperated sigh. "Look, mon ami, we both know where this is going. You're stuck. If you were supposed to be here, you'd have backup. You wouldn't be bullshitting about exercises." The corporal shifted uncomfortably. His fingers twitched at his side. "This is ridiculous. We're French. You're treating us like the enemy." Moreau smirked. "Then stop acting like the enemy." Another silence. One of the soldiers in the enemy unit, standing closer to the tree line, leaned toward his companion. "What the hell do we do?" he whispered, but the sound carried. The lieutenant heard it too. His nostrils flared as he exhaled sharply. He was losing control of his men. Moreau knew it. Then, the lieutenant sighed, and slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands. Moreau's breath remained steady, his rifle still raised, but he knew it was over. The lieutenant's rifle slipped from his grip, falling to the dirt with a dull thud. A moment passed. Then, one by one, the rest of the Paris regiment followed suit. The sound of weapons hitting the ground filled the clearing. It was over. Moreau signaled to Renaud. His second-in-command immediately moved forward, directing men to secure the surrendered weapons. The Renault R-35 didn't move, didn't shift. Its presence was still a silent warning. Moreau took a deep breath and stepped toward the lieutenant. The man watched him carefully, his eyes colder now. Moreau spoke first. "Now, you're going to explain to me what a regiment from Paris is doing this deep in border territory, with no orders, no insignia, and no paperwork." The lieutenant didn't reply right away. Instead, he let a small smirk curl at the corner of his lips. Then, softly, he spoke. "Captain Moreau." A chill crept down Moreau's spine. He hadn't introduced himself. The lieutenant tilted his head slightly, eyes studying him. Then, slowly, he chuckled. "You've stirred the hornet's nest, Capitaine." Moreau's expression didn't change, but his mind raced. The lieutenant leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Moreau and Renaud could hear. "Be prepared, Moreau. Either for a court-martial or death." The words hung between them, suffocating. Moreau didn't flinch, but deep inside, he knew.